A story so unbelievable that when one of its survivors tried to tell the world what happened, many people simply couldn't accept it. A giant whale had done something almost no sailor believed possible. It deliberately turned, charged, and sank a fully equipped American whale ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Before we settle into tonight's story, I'd love to know something. What time is it where you're listening from? Are you relaxing in the quiet hours of the evening, or has sleep simply decided to stay away for a while? Let me know which country you're joining from down in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how many different corners of the world gather together for these slow journeys through history. And if you find calm, comfort, or simply good company in these stories, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It truly helps this little community of history lovers continue to grow. Now dim the lights if you can. Find a comfortable place to rest. Let the worries of today drift somewhere beyond the horizon, because tonight we're sailing into one of the strangest true stories ever recorded at sea. For decades, people wondered whether the tale had been exaggerated. Then other witnesses, journals, official records, and careful historians confirmed the details. This extraordinary disaster would eventually inspire one of the greatest novels ever written, Moby-Dick. But the reality behind the fiction was, in many ways, even more haunting. So let us leave behind the modern world. Imagine the smell of salt carried by a cold Atlantic breeze. Picture weathered wooden docks stretching into dark water. Hear the distant cries of gulls circling above crowded harbors. The year is 1820. The place is Nantucket, Massachusetts. Long before offshore drilling or giant steel tankers carried oil around the world, whale oil illuminated cities. It burned in street lamps, lit homes. It fueled businesses that depended on reliable light after sunset. In many ways, whales provided one of the world's most valuable natural resources. That demand transformed Nantucket into one of America's richest seafaring communities. Nearly every family on the island had some connection to whaling. Fathers disappeared for years aboard ships. Brothers learned navigation before they reached adulthood. Sons dreamed of becoming captains. Even those who never stepped aboard depended on successful voyages returning safely. The ocean offered fortunes. It also claimed them. Every departure from Nantucket carried hope mixed with quiet fear. Families gathered at the docks, exchanging embraces that might be their last. There were no radios, no telegraphs stretching across oceans. Once a ship vanished beyond the horizon, years might pass before anyone heard news again. Sometimes the ship returned heavily loaded with valuable whale oil. Sometimes it returned damaged. Sometimes only a few exhausted survivors walked back onto the docks. Nothing returned at all. Among the hundreds of vessels that sailed from Nantucket, one appeared perfectly ordinary. She was named Essex. By 1820, the Essex was already about 20 years old. Built in Amesbury, Massachusetts, she measured roughly 87 feet in length and displaced just over 200 tons. Compared with enormous modern ships, she would seem surprisingly small. Yet she had already completed several successful whaling voyages. Her wooden hull had crossed thousands upon thousands of miles. She had weathered storms. She had survived rough seas. Her owners expected another profitable expedition. Nobody standing on the docks that August morning imagined the voyage would become one of maritime history's most famous disasters. Commanding the ship was Captain George Pollard, Jr. He was only 29 years old. Today, 29 may seem remarkably young to command an ocean-going vessel responsible for dozens of lives and a valuable cargo. But Nantucket captains often gained experience from childhood. Pollard had grown up surrounded by whaling traditions. His first mate, Owen Chase, possessed a different personality. Where Pollard tended toward quiet reserve, Chase projected confidence and determination. He had earned respect through practical seamanship and hard work rather than family reputation. Also aboard was a teenage cabin boy named Thomas Nickerson. He was only 14 years old. At that age, many young people today are beginning high school. Nickerson was preparing to spend years crossing oceans filled with dangers impossible to predict. He would witness events that stayed with him for the rest of his life. Years later, his written account would become one of historians' most valuable sources for understanding exactly what happened. In total, 20 men boarded the Essex. Each carried personal hopes. Some dreamed of wealth. Others hoped to support wives or aging parents. Some simply followed the only profession they had ever known. As supplies disappeared into the ship's hold, barrels were carefully arranged. Food, fresh water, navigation equipment, replacement sails, rope, harpoons, lances, massive casks waiting to be filled with whale oil. Everything necessary for a voyage expected to last 2 or perhaps 3 years. When at last the sails caught the Atlantic wind, the people gathered along Nantucket's shore slowly grew smaller. Families waved hats and handkerchiefs. Children pointed toward the departing vessel. The Essex slipped steadily toward open water. No one could know that many watching would never again embrace the men aboard. The voyage did not begin dramatically. Like many whaling expeditions, it settled into routine. Hours merged into days. Days merged into weeks. The crew repaired sails, scrubbed decks, maintained equipment, and watched endlessly across empty horizons. Life aboard demanded discipline. Fresh water had to be carefully rationed. Food needed protection from moisture and rats. Every rope required constant inspection. Even a small failure could become deadly thousands of miles from land. Storms occasionally interrupted the routine. Towering waves crashed against the hull. Masts groaned under enormous strain. Rain soaked every surface. Yet experienced sailors accepted such hardships as ordinary parts of life at sea. Much more dangerous than storms was failure. A whaleship that returned with nearly empty oil barrels represented financial disaster. Captains constantly searched for signs of sperm whales. These magnificent animals could dive thousands of feet beneath the ocean's surface and remain underwater for astonishing lengths of time. Finding them required patience. Catching them required courage. Once a whale was spotted, several small open boats were lowered from the ship. Each contained only a handful of men armed with hand-thrown harpoons. The hunters approached quietly, very quietly, close enough to see the whale's enormous back rising through gentle swells, close enough to hear its powerful breathing. Only then would someone stand, balance carefully despite the rolling sea, and throw a heavy harpoon with all his strength. What followed became known among whalers as the Nantucket sleigh ride. The wounded whale often fled at tremendous speed, dragging the tiny boat across the ocean, sometimes for miles, sometimes until exhaustion overcame both hunters and hunted. Only afterward could lances be used to kill the whale. It was dangerous work. Boats overturned, men drowned, harpoons snapped. Whales struck back with tails capable of smashing wood like kindling. Yet almost no one imagined a sperm whale attacking the large mothership itself. That possibility belonged more to sailors' tales than accepted reality. As the Essex rounded Cape Horn near the southern tip of South America, powerful winds battered the aging vessel. The passage tested every sailor aboard. Cold waves swept the decks. Rigging iced over. Progress slowed. But eventually, the ship entered the vast Pacific Ocean. Ahead stretched one of the largest expanses of water on Earth. Somewhere beyond that endless blue waited the whales they had traveled so far to find. The crew believed the hardest part of the voyage was behind them. They could not yet see that history was quietly steering toward them from beneath the surface of the sea. And the creature that would change everything had already begun swimming through the same Pacific waters. The Pacific has a remarkable way of making even the busiest ship feel completely alone. After rounding Cape Horn, the Essex entered an ocean so immense that weeks could pass without another vessel appearing on the horizon. Day after day, the crew saw nothing but water stretching in every direction. The sea rose and fell with long, gentle swells that seemed to breathe beneath the ship. Above them, clouds drifted across an endless sky, and at night the stars appeared brighter than anywhere on land. For the 20 men aboard the Essex, this emptiness was both beautiful and unsettling. Their world had become a floating island of oak timbers and canvas sails. Every morning followed a familiar rhythm. Before sunrise, men climbed the rigging to adjust the sails for changing winds. Others scrubbed the deck with seawater to prevent it from becoming dangerously slippery. Meals were simple: salted beef, hard biscuits known as hardtack, dried peas, and whatever fresh food remained from the beginning of the voyage. Fresh vegetables had disappeared months earlier. Fresh water was precious. Every cup mattered. No one wasted a single drop. Life aboard demanded constant work. Wooden ships required endless maintenance. Salt water seeped into every crack. Ropes frayed under constant tension. Iron fittings rusted. Pumps had to remove water that slowly leaked into the hull. There was never a day when someone wasn't repairing something. Young Thomas Nickerson watched everything with curious eyes. Only 14 years old, he was learning lessons no classroom could teach. He carried messages between officers, cleaned the captain's cabin, helped prepare meals, and performed whatever duties were assigned to him. Like many cabin boys of the era, he hoped years of hard work would eventually earn him a higher position aboard future voyages. He admired experienced sailors. They could read changing weather by watching clouds. They could estimate wind direction almost without thinking. They could tie dozens of complicated knots in darkness. To Thomas, these men seemed almost magical. Yet beneath their confidence lay quiet respect for the ocean. No sailor believed he had conquered the sea. The sea merely allowed people to cross it for a time. Captain George Pollard Jr. carried enormous responsibility. Every decision rested on his shoulders. He determined the ship's course, managed supplies, settled disputes among the crew, and balanced the financial expectations of the ship's owners with the safety of his men. It was not an easy burden. His first mate, Owen Chase, often supervised much of the daily work. Chase possessed remarkable energy. Fellow sailors considered him skilled, ambitious, and fearless during whale hunts. If Pollard represented calm authority, Chase embodied determination and action. The two officers respected one another, although their personalities differed. Neither could imagine the impossible choice they would soon face. Weeks turned into months. The Essex visited known whaling grounds, searching for sperm whales whose valuable oil made long voyages worthwhile. Sometimes they found whales. Sometimes entire weeks passed without a single sighting. Whaling itself required extraordinary teamwork. Whenever someone high in the mast shouted the famous cry, "There she blows!" every man aboard reacted instantly. Lookouts scanned the sea. Boat crews prepared equipment. Harpoons were checked. Coils of rope were carefully arranged so they would run freely when the whale fled. Within minutes, several small whaleboats splashed into the ocean. Each measured only about 28 feet long. Compared with the enormous sperm whales they hunted, these boats looked astonishingly fragile. A mature male sperm whale could exceed 50 feet in length and weigh more than 50 tons. Its head alone could measure nearly 1/3 of its body. Its powerful tail could launch tremendous force with a single movement. Yet generations of Nantucket whalers had learned methods that made these dangerous hunts possible. Patience mattered more than speed. The boats approached quietly. The whale often remained unaware until the final moments. Then came the harpoon. A successful strike rarely ended the hunt. Instead, it began one. The wounded whale usually dove or swam rapidly away, dragging the tiny boat behind it by the attached rope. Men gripped the sides tightly as seawater sprayed over them. If the rope tangled around a sailor's leg or arm, the results could be fatal. There were many stories of men pulled overboard and carried beneath the waves before anyone could cut them free. Every hunt balanced courage against risk. Eventually, when the exhausted whale slowed, hunters approached again with long lances. Only after the animal died could the difficult work of towing it back to the ship begin. Then came another exhausting process. The whale's blubber was stripped away in enormous sections. Large iron pots aboard the ship boiled the blubber into oil. The smell was unforgettable. Greasy smoke drifted through the air for days. Clothing absorbed the odor. Hair absorbed the odor. Even the wooden ship itself seemed permanently scented with whale oil. By late 1820, the Essex had collected some oil, but nowhere near enough for a profitable voyage. Captain Pollard wanted more. Like every whaling captain, he hoped to return home with a full cargo. The crew shared that hope. Their earnings depended largely on the success of the expedition. Unlike many modern professions, sailors aboard whale ships often received a lay, a percentage of the voyage's profits rather than regular wages. A disappointing voyage meant disappointing pay. As autumn approached in the northern hemisphere, the Essex sailed deeper into the Pacific. One destination attracted increasing attention among whalers. It was an area west of South America where sperm whales had reportedly become plentiful. Reports spread from ship to ship. Captains exchanged information whenever they met. Successful hunting grounds never remained secret for long. Pollard adjusted his course accordingly. The decision appeared perfectly reasonable. It followed the best information available. History would later remember it for a different reason. On November 16, 1820, the Essex reached waters near the equator, thousands of miles from the nearest continent. No land interrupted the horizon. No rescue station existed. No harbor offered safety. If disaster struck there, survival would depend entirely upon those aboard. The following days brought encouraging signs. Lookouts spotted whales more frequently. Excitement spread across the ship. The men prepared the whaleboats with renewed energy. After months at sea, they had finally reached promising hunting grounds. On the morning of November 20th, conditions seemed nearly perfect. The weather remained calm. Visibility stretched for miles. The sea rolled gently beneath the sunlight. Several sperm whales appeared nearby. Captain Pollard ordered the boats lowered. 3 whaleboats slipped into the water, each carrying officers and crew eager for a successful hunt. The Essex herself remained behind, attended by the few sailors necessary to manage the ship. At first, everything unfolded exactly as countless whale hunts had before. The boats separated. Each pursued different whales. Harpoons flew. The chase began. Then, during one pursuit, Owen Chase's boat suffered unexpected damage when a whale's powerful tail struck it. The collision shattered parts of the small craft. His men struggled to make temporary repairs while floating upon the open sea. As Chase worked frantically to save his damaged boat, something unusual happened aboard the Essex. The sailors remaining on the ship noticed an enormous sperm whale nearby. Behaved strangely. Instead of swimming away from the vessel, as whales almost always did, it appeared to stop. The animal floated nearly motionless. Observers later estimated it measured around 85 feet in length, though exact measurements were impossible amid the confusion. For several quiet moments, the whale simply watched the ship. Then, without warning, it began moving directly toward the Essex. At first, its speed seemed almost leisurely, but with every passing second, it accelerated. No one aboard yet understood they were witnessing an event that would become one of the most extraordinary encounters ever recorded in maritime history. At first, the men aboard the Essex struggled to understand what they were seeing. The great sperm whale was no longer drifting lazily through the calm Pacific. It was moving with purpose. One sailor later recalled that the animal appeared to gather speed in a perfectly straight line. Its enormous head remained just below the surface, creating a broad swell of water ahead of it. From the deck, the whale seemed almost unreal in size. The men shouted to one another. Some believed the whale would dive before reaching the ship. That was what whales usually did. A large vessel was not something they attacked. A whaleship was noisy. Its hull creaked. The wind filled its sails. To a whale, it should have been an object to avoid. But this whale did not turn. Kept coming. Within moments, the distance disappeared. The whale struck the Essex squarely on the starboard side. The impact was violent. The entire ship shuddered. Heavy timbers groaned under the tremendous force. Men were thrown from their feet as the deck lurched beneath them. Barrels shifted inside the hold. Rigging swung wildly overhead. For a brief moment there was stunned silence. Then came confusion. The whale drifted away. To the surprise of the sailors, it appeared almost dazed by the collision. Witnesses later described the animal remaining nearly motionless, as though it too had been shaken by the impact. The crew rushed to inspect the damage. Water had entered the hull. But at first glance, the situation did not appear hopeless. Wooden ships leaked from time to time. Pumps existed for precisely that reason. Experienced sailors knew how to deal with damaged planking. Some believed they had escaped a serious disaster. Perhaps the whale had simply become frightened. Perhaps it had struck the ship by accident. There was no reason to think it would return. Then someone looked toward the open sea. The whale had turned around. Far away now, it floated almost perfectly still. Its massive head faced directly toward the Essex. Several survivors later described the same remarkable sight. The whale seemed to pause, almost as if gathering itself. Then it began swimming forward once more. Slowly at first, then faster and faster. The water around its enormous body foamed white. The sailors watched in disbelief. No one had ever prepared them for this. There were stories told in ports about angry whales. Sailors loved dramatic tales. But seasoned whalemen separated rumor from reality. They understood whale behavior through years of experience. Nothing in that experience explained what was unfolding before their eyes. The animal accelerated with astonishing speed, straight toward the ship. Captain Pollard was away in one of the whaleboats. Responsibility aboard the Essex fell to First Mate Owen Chase's replacement officers who remained aboard, but events were moving far too quickly for careful planning. The whale crashed into the bow. This second collision was devastating. The sound echoed through the ship like exploding timber. Massive beams splintered. The bow was crushed inward. Planks burst apart. Water rushed through the shattered hull with terrifying force. Several sailors later remembered hearing what sounded like countless pieces of wood snapping at once. The Essex was mortally wounded. The whale disappeared beneath the surface. This time it did not return. It simply vanished into the immense Pacific. The men stood frozen. Then reality struck. The ship was sinking. Not slowly. Not over several hours. The ocean poured into the broken hull faster than the pumps could ever remove it. Someone shouted for axes. Others scrambled below deck. They knew they had only minutes. Far across the water, the three whaleboats saw the confusion aboard the mothership. Captain Pollard noticed unusual movement. Men waved desperately. Voices carried faintly across the calm sea. At first, the officers in the boats could not understand what had happened. They rowed as quickly as possible toward the Essex. As Owen Chase approached, the terrible truth became clear. The ship's bow had been crushed. Water flooded the hold. The vessel that had carried them safely across thousands of miles of ocean was dying before their eyes. Years later, Chase described the scene with remarkable restraint. He simply wrote that the ship was going down. Those simple words concealed unimaginable horror. The Essex represented everything. It carried their food, their fresh water, their navigation instruments, their tools, their spare clothing, their shelter. Without the ship, 20 men would be left in 3 tiny open boats thousands of miles from civilization. There was no nearby island they knew of. No rescue service. No radio. No signal flares. No steamship likely to appear over the horizon. Only the Pacific. Endless Pacific. Captain Pollard immediately ordered everyone to save whatever supplies they could. The crew worked with astonishing speed despite the danger. Barrels of hardtack were hauled from below. Small casks of fresh water followed. Navigation instruments were rescued. Few tools, some sails, compasses, pieces of timber. Every item might mean the difference between life and death in the weeks ahead. As water continued rising inside the hull, time became desperately short. The Essex settled lower. Its bow dipped beneath the surface. The stern lifted slightly. The familiar deck that had been their home for more than a year tilted beneath their feet. The men climbed into the 3 whaleboats, carefully loading the rescued supplies. These boats had never been intended for long voyages. They were hunting craft, open to wind, open to rain, open to relentless sun. Each measured only around 28 feet long. Now they would become homes. Captain Pollard remained remarkably composed. His calmness helped steady the crew. Panic would only waste precious energy. The men tied the whaleboats together using ropes so they would not drift apart while deciding their next move. Nearby floated the broken Essex. For a time, the damaged hull refused to disappear completely. It drifted helplessly, slowly filling with seawater. The crew watched silently. Many had spent years aboard her. They had scrubbed her decks, repaired her sails, shared meals upon her planks, laughed together during calm evenings, survived storms within her wooden walls. Now the ocean claimed her piece by piece. As daylight faded, the sinking ship became strangely peaceful. The frantic activity ended. Only gentle waves moved around the shattered hull. The silence felt unnatural. No hammering, no creaking rigging under sail, no familiar footsteps across the deck. Only water. Hours earlier they had been experienced whalemen aboard a seaworthy vessel. Now they were castaways, thousands of miles from home. That evening, the officers gathered to consider their options. The nearest known islands were difficult to reach. South America lay far to the east. The Society Islands and other parts of Polynesia lay much closer in terms of distance. Yet there was a problem. Sailors had heard stories, many exaggerated, some based on real encounters, about islands where visitors might face violent resistance from local inhabitants. In the early 19th century, fear of so-called cannibal islands circulated widely among mariners, even though such accounts often mixed fact, rumor, and misunderstanding. Those fears would heavily influence the officers' decision. Instead of steering toward some of the nearer Pacific islands, they began considering a far longer route toward the coast of South America. At the time it seemed the safer choice. History would later question that decision. But no one making it could know the suffering that lay ahead. As darkness settled across the Pacific, the broken remains of the Essex drifted nearby like the ghost of the life they had lost. 20 exhausted men climbed into 3 fragile boats. Above them stretched a sky filled with brilliant stars. Below them lay nearly 2,000 miles of open ocean. And none of them, not even the oldest sailor among them, could imagine that the sinking of the Essex was only the beginning of one of history's greatest survival stories. Morning arrived quietly. The Pacific gave little sign that one of the most extraordinary disasters in maritime history had taken place only hours earlier. Gentle swells lifted the 3 whaleboats as if nothing had changed. The sky glowed with soft shades of orange before the sun climbed above the horizon, warming the endless blue water. But for the 20 men drifting beside the wreck of the Essex, everything had changed. They had survived the sinking. Now they had to survive the ocean. The damaged whaleship still floated, though only barely. Much of her bow remained underwater, and each passing hour allowed more seawater to flood through the shattered timbers. Captain George Pollard knew the ship would not remain afloat much longer. The crew made one final journey aboard her. Working carefully, they searched every corner that remained above water. They recovered additional food, more navigational tools, nails, bits of rope, sailcloth, and several pieces of timber that might later prove useful. Every object had value now. Something as ordinary as a small knife or an extra bucket could determine whether a man lived or died. The rescued supplies were divided among the 3 boats. It was not an easy task. The boats had been designed for hunting whales, not carrying weeks or months of provisions. Every added pound pushed them lower into the water. Yet leaving supplies behind seemed equally dangerous. Eventually they reached a careful balance. Enough food to offer hope. Enough water to delay thirst. Not enough of either to guarantee survival. The officers studied their charts. This discussion would become one of the most debated decisions in maritime history. Several islands lay far closer than the coast of South America. The nearest significant land was the Marquesas Islands, while other islands of Polynesia also offered possible refuge. Under normal circumstances, sailing there would have required far fewer miles than attempting to reach the South American mainland. But the decision was influenced by what sailors of the early 19th century believed. For generations, stories had spread through ports about islands in the Pacific where visitors might be attacked or killed. Some accounts described violent encounters that had genuinely occurred. Others grew larger with every retelling until rumor and fact became almost impossible to separate. Today, historians recognize that many of these tales greatly exaggerated the dangers and reflected misunderstandings between European sailors and Pacific Island communities. The officers aboard the Essex, however, could only make decisions using the knowledge available to them in 1820. Captain Pollard, Owen Chase, and second mate Matthew Joy discussed the options carefully. In the end, they rejected the shorter route. Instead, they chose to sail eastward toward the coast of South America, a journey of roughly 2,000 nautical miles. It was an astonishing distance for 3 open whaleboats. No one pretended the voyage would be easy, but they believed it offered the best chance of avoiding dangers they feared even more than starvation. With the decision made, another challenge remained. The boats themselves required modification. Originally built for short whale hunts lasting hours or perhaps a day, they offered almost no protection from weather. Waves could easily wash over their low sides. The tropical sun would beat down without mercy during daylight, while cold nights brought chilling winds. The men used spare boards from the Essex to raise the sides of each boat. They fastened extra planks with nails and rope wherever possible. Pieces of sailcloth were arranged to provide limited shelter. The work was crude but necessary. Every small improvement might help keep seawater out during rough conditions. Young Thomas Nickerson worked alongside men twice his age. His hands blistered from hauling lumber and driving nails. No one spared him because he was only 14. The ocean showed no special kindness to youth. Everyone labored. Everyone carried responsibility. By late afternoon, the preparations were complete. The Essex herself seemed ready to surrender. She settled lower than before. The stern still rose above the water, but only just. The crew gathered silently for one last look. Some removed their hats. Others simply stared. For more than a year, she had been their world. Within her narrow wooden walls they had celebrated small successes, argued over daily work, repaired sails during storms, and dreamed of returning home with full barrels of whale oil. Now she was becoming part of the Pacific. Captain Pollard gave the order. The ropes connecting the boats to the sinking ship were cast off. Slowly, using short oars until the sails caught the breeze, the 3 whaleboats began moving away. No one spoke. Behind them, the Essex drifted alone. As evening approached, the sea finally claimed her. The stern lifted almost gracefully. Water rushed across the remaining deck. The masts leaned. Then, with surprising quietness, the ship disappeared beneath the surface. Only scattered pieces of floating timber marked the place where she had vanished. For several minutes, the sailors watched the empty water. Some later admitted they expected the whale to appear again. Never did. Whatever had driven the enormous animal to attack had ended. The whale vanished from history as suddenly as it had entered it. The men aboard the boats now faced a different enemy: distance. Their 3 boats sailed close together, careful not to lose sight of one another. During daylight this proved manageable. At night, however, darkness quickly swallowed everything beyond a short distance. They agreed upon signals. If one boat drifted too far away, those aboard would shout or wave lanterns whenever possible. Separation could be fatal. One boat alone stood almost no chance. The officers also established strict daily rations. The amount was painfully small. Each man received only a few ounces of hardtack and a carefully measured portion of water. No exceptions. Not for officers. Not for ordinary sailors. Not even for the youngest aboard. Captain Pollard understood the mathematics of survival. If they consumed too much during the first week, they would certainly starve later. If they rationed carefully, there remained hope. Hope was now almost as valuable as food. The first days passed quietly. A steady breeze pushed the little boats eastward. Flying fish occasionally landed inside the boats during the night, providing unexpected fresh meals. The men welcomed every one of them. Sometimes seabirds circled overhead. Once or twice they managed to catch one. Its meat was divided into tiny portions so everyone received at least a taste. No one complained. Even the smallest piece of fresh food lifted spirits. Conversation often turned toward home. Some spoke of Nantucket. Others remembered wives waiting faithfully. Several described children who would scarcely recognize them after years away. Thomas Nickerson listened more than he spoke. He imagined the streets of home. The familiar smell of wood smoke. His mother's face. Simple comforts that had once seemed ordinary now felt unimaginably precious. The Pacific remained deceptively calm. Blue skies stretched overhead. Gentle winds filled the small sails. Had another ship appeared in those first few days, the disaster might have ended there. But none came. The ocean was simply too vast. A vessel could pass 50 miles away and never be seen. Each sunrise brought another horizon empty in every direction. The officers carefully checked their navigation each day using compass, dead reckoning, and whatever celestial observations conditions allowed. They needed favorable winds. They needed fair weather. Most of all, they needed luck. The men still believed rescue, or at least land, might be reached before their supplies became dangerously low. They did not yet realize how slowly 3 overloaded whaleboats crossed the immense Pacific. Nor could they know that nature was already preparing new trials. The whale had destroyed their ship in only a few terrifying moments. The ocean intended to test them much more patiently. Day after endless day. The first week passed more slowly than anyone aboard the 3 whaleboats expected. When the Essex had still been afloat, a day had always contained work. There were sails to trim, decks to clean, ropes to inspect, tools to repair and watches to stand. Life aboard a whaleship followed a routine that kept both hands and minds occupied. Now, in the open boats, there was very little to do except endure. The sails remained set whenever the wind allowed. Someone watched the compass. Someone checked the horizon. Someone bailed seawater whenever a wave splashed aboard. Beyond those simple tasks there was mostly waiting. Waiting for favorable winds. Waiting for rain. Waiting for land. Waiting for another ship. Every sunrise brought renewed hope. Every sunset carried disappointment. The Pacific seemed almost determined to remain empty. Not a sail appeared on the horizon. No smoke from distant ships. No coastline. Only the endless meeting of sky and sea. The men had entered one of the loneliest places on Earth. Modern maps make the Pacific seem manageable, reduced to blue shapes on paper or a computer screen. But from a small open boat, its scale became almost impossible to comprehend. Day after day nothing changed. The horizon formed a perfect circle around them. It gave the strange impression that the world itself had become smaller, shrinking until it contained only 3 fragile boats drifting beneath an enormous sky. Captain George Pollard insisted the daily rations remain unchanged. Each man received a carefully measured portion of hardtack and only a small quantity of fresh water. The amount was enough to keep a person alive. It was nowhere near enough to satisfy hunger. The hardtack itself was unpleasant. These biscuits had been baked until nearly all moisture disappeared, allowing them to survive long sea voyages without spoiling. They were as hard as pieces of wood. Sailors often softened them by soaking them briefly in water before eating. Even then, they remained difficult to chew. Many contained tiny insects. Experienced sailors rarely complained. Protein, after all, was protein. Now nobody wasted a crumb. If even a small piece fell into the bottom of a boat, someone carefully picked it up and ate it. Nothing could be spared. Fresh water demanded even greater discipline. The officers measured every serving with remarkable care. No sailor received extra simply because he asked. Not even Captain Pollard took more than his allotted share. Leadership required example. The men noticed. It helped maintain trust during circumstances that could easily have led to conflict. As the tropical sun climbed higher each day, thirst became their constant companion. The boats offered almost no shade. The sunlight reflected from the ocean with blinding intensity. Faces reddened, lips cracked, hands blistered despite years of experience. Salt dried across clothing and skin, leaving white crystals wherever seawater evaporated. The heat during the afternoon became exhausting. Then, almost without warning, night transformed the ocean. Temperatures dropped sharply. The damp sea air chilled men whose clothes never truly dried. Those who had suffered beneath the afternoon sun now shivered until dawn. The body rarely found comfort. Young Thomas Nickerson later remembered how difficult it became to sleep. The boats rocked constantly. There was scarcely room to stretch one's legs. Every movement threatened to disturb someone else. The sailors slept in short intervals rather than long, peaceful rest. Dreams often returned them home. Many awoke believing they were back aboard the Essex. Then reality returned with painful clarity. Above them stretched unfamiliar stars. Below them floated a narrow wooden boat. The ship was gone. One afternoon, dark clouds gathered to the west. At first, the men welcomed the sight. Rain meant fresh water. They hurriedly prepared every container they possessed. Buckets, cooking pots, even hats could collect precious drops. The storm approached slowly. Wind strengthened. Small waves became larger. The boats rose and fell more sharply. Then the rain arrived. The men opened their mouths toward the sky. Cool water washed salt from their faces. Some laughed for the first time since the Essex had sunk. Fresh rainwater tasted sweeter than anything they could remember. They collected as much as possible. The shower lasted only a short time. Yet it restored both their water supply and, perhaps even more importantly, their spirits. Nature had reminded them that not every force in the Pacific worked against them. The following days brought another surprise. Schools of flying fish occasionally burst from the sea, gliding astonishing distances above the waves before splashing back into the water. During the night, some became confused by the boats. Several landed directly inside. The sailors grabbed them immediately. Fresh fish required no invitation. Small fires could not be lit aboard the open boats, so the fish were eaten raw. Modern readers might find the idea unpleasant. To starving sailors, it was an unexpected gift. The fresh flesh contained moisture as well as nourishment. Every catch mattered. Seabirds occasionally followed the boats. Experienced sailors knew birds sometimes indicated nearby islands, but they also knew certain species ranged hundreds of miles from land. The birds offered hope, not certainty. Whenever one landed within reach, the crew attempted to catch it. Some escaped. Few did not. Again, every piece of meat was divided as equally as possible. The officers understood fairness was essential. Jealousy over food could destroy discipline faster than hunger itself. Despite these small blessings, supplies continued shrinking. Each evening the officers quietly recalculated. How many biscuits remained? How much water? How many days could they continue before reductions became unavoidable? The answers grew less encouraging. Still, Captain Pollard maintained confidence in public. He spoke calmly. He reminded the men that favorable winds continued pushing them eastward. Distance, he said, disappeared 1 mile at a time. There was truth in those words. Yet the Pacific measured its distances in thousands of miles. One evening, Owen Chase studied the western horizon as the sun disappeared. The sky glowed brilliant shades of orange and crimson. The ocean reflected those colors until sea and sky seemed almost identical. It was breathtakingly beautiful, and deeply unsettling. Beauty did not fill empty stomachs, nor did it shorten the voyage. The silence of the Pacific became another challenge. There were long periods when no one spoke. Only the gentle splash of waves against the hull interrupted the quiet. Each sailor drifted into private thoughts. Some prayed. Some calculated how far they might have traveled. Others remembered ordinary moments from home. A warm meal, the smell of fresh bread, family conversation. Things once taken for granted became treasures in memory. Thomas Nickerson later recalled that homesickness itself became almost painful. Not because he believed he would never return, but because remembering home made the present seem even harsher. Yet hope still remained. The men believed they were making progress. They had survived the sinking. They had secured food and water. The weather had, for the most part, treated them kindly. Surely fortune could not abandon them completely. But the Pacific is famous for testing optimism. Without warning, the steady trade winds that had carried them eastward began to weaken. Their small sails hung with less purpose. The boat slowed. Then, for stretches of the day, they barely moved at all. The ocean became strangely smooth, beautiful, quiet, almost motionless. To someone watching from shore, it would have looked peaceful beyond imagination. To 20 exhausted sailors depending entirely on the wind, it was terrifying, because a calm sea could be just as dangerous as a storm. With every hour of stillness, the precious food and water continued disappearing. And somewhere ahead, still hidden beyond the curve of the earth, lay a tiny speck of land that would briefly offer salvation, before leading the survivors toward even greater suffering than they had yet endured. The calm did not last forever. After several anxious days, a steady breeze returned, filling the patched sails of the 3 whaleboats once again. The little craft leaned gently as they moved eastward across the Pacific. Progress was slow, but at least they were moving. To the men aboard, motion meant hope. Every mile carried them closer to land, or so they believed. Captain George Pollard and First Mate Owen Chase continued to compare their calculations whenever conditions allowed. Navigation in open boats was far more difficult than aboard a full-sized ship. Instruments had survived the sinking of the Essex, but using them from boats constantly rising and falling with the sea required patience and experience. Even the most skilled navigator could never know his exact position. Clouds sometimes hid the sun. The rolling sea complicated observations. Currents quietly pushed the boats off course. Every estimate carried uncertainty. Still, the officers agreed they were making progress. The men clung to that belief. Their daily routine had become painfully predictable. Wake before sunrise. Check the boats for leaks. Measure the day's rations. Adjust the sails. Watch the horizon. There were no newspapers. No conversations with strangers. No changing scenery. Only water. Hour after hour, the Pacific surrounded them with almost complete silence. The monotony became its own kind of hardship. Several sailors later described how easily the mind wandered. Some counted the waves. Others recited Bible verses they had memorized as children. A few quietly sang songs from Nantucket, though never loudly enough to disturb the calm around them. Thomas Nickerson found himself studying the clouds. Sometimes they resembled ships, sometimes hills, sometimes familiar faces from home. For a few brief moments, imagination softened reality. Then the clouds drifted apart, leaving only empty sky. Food continued to disappear. The officers opened the remaining casks and counted the biscuits carefully. Nothing could be left to chance. Every man understood the mathematics. If 20 men consumed one day's supply today, there would be one day less tomorrow. There was no possibility of buying more. No nearby port. No friendly harbor. Only what they had rescued from the sinking Essex. Fortunately, nature occasionally provided unexpected assistance. Flying fish continued to visit the boats during the night. Sometimes only one landed aboard. Occasionally several appeared at once, scattering wildly across the wooden floorboards before anyone could catch them. The sailors reacted instantly. No fish escaped if human hands could reach it. They also noticed sea turtles from time to time. These creatures offered far more food than a single fish, but catching one from a small drifting boat required remarkable luck. Most slipped beneath the surface long before anyone came close enough. The men watched them disappear with quiet disappointment. Every missed opportunity reminded them how uncertain survival remained. As the days stretched on, conversation turned increasingly toward land. Maps were discussed repeatedly. Distances estimated. Old voyages remembered. Experienced whalers exchanged stories about islands they had visited years earlier. Each account ended the same way. If only they had been closer. If only another ship appeared. If only the wind remained favorable. Hope depended heavily upon those two words. If only. Several days after leaving the wreck of the Essex, the lookout in one of the boats suddenly stood upright. He pointed toward the horizon. First, nobody else saw anything. The sea shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, creating countless illusions. Many sailors had mistaken clouds for islands before. Everyone looked carefully. Minutes passed. Then another man saw it. Faint dark shape. Barely visible. Not cloud. Not wave. Land. The word spread quickly from boat to boat. Land! Exhausted men who had barely spoken all morning suddenly found new strength. Some gripped their oars to help the boats move faster whenever the wind weakened. Others simply stared ahead, afraid the island might disappear like a mirage. Hour by hour the shape grew larger. Rocky cliffs slowly emerged from the haze. Scattered vegetation became visible. Then unmistakable shorelines appeared. The island was Henderson Island, a remote coral island in the South Pacific, though the survivors did not know its modern name with certainty at the time. Seemed almost miraculous. After weeks surrounded by nothing but ocean, solid ground lay before them. As evening approached, the three boats reached the shore. The men stepped onto land with difficulty. Their legs had grown accustomed to the constant motion of the sea. Several stumbled. Others simply knelt and touched the ground. The sensation felt unfamiliar after so many days afloat. Fresh water was their first concern. Searching carefully, they located small sources of water among the island's natural features. The supply was limited but real. Never had ordinary fresh water tasted so wonderful. Then came food. The island offered something equally precious. Birds nested there in considerable numbers. Eggs could be gathered. Seabirds themselves were caught. Crabs moved among the rocks. Edible plants were discovered after cautious examination. For the first time since the Essex had sunk, the men ate until they were no longer desperately hungry. It was not a feast by ordinary standards. To them it felt like abundance. The atmosphere changed noticeably. Faces that had grown thin began showing faint smiles again. Conversations became longer. For a short while, survival no longer seemed impossible. The island itself, however, revealed important limitations. Fresh water remained scarce. Vegetation was sparse. There was little room for 20 men to establish a lasting settlement. Captain Pollard and the officers quickly realized Henderson Island could not support them indefinitely. It offered relief, not rescue. They remained astonishingly far from regular shipping routes. If they simply waited, another vessel might never arrive. The difficult decision returned. Should they remain, or continue sailing? The officers carefully examined the available food. They collected every resource the island could spare. Birds were preserved as well as circumstances allowed. Additional water filled every container. The boats were inspected and repaired once again using whatever materials proved useful. During these discussions, 3 crew members reached a different conclusion. William Wright, Seth Weeks, Thomas Chappell. They believed leaving the island would be more dangerous than staying. No one could guarantee rescue, but neither could anyone guarantee survival across thousands more miles of open ocean. After thoughtful discussion, Captain Pollard respected their decision. The 3 men would remain behind. The other 17 would continue eastward. It was a remarkable moment. Companions who had sailed together aboard the Essex now faced permanent separation. There were quiet handshakes, simple farewells. No one knew which group had chosen correctly. Those sailing away hoped the islanders would eventually be rescued. Those remaining hoped the boats would safely reach civilization. Both hopes rested entirely upon chance. When the sails were raised once more, the 2 worlds slowly drifted apart. 3 figures stood watching from the rocky shore. 17 others watched from the boats. The distance widened. Soon voices could no longer carry across the water. Eventually, the island itself became smaller. Then only a dark shape upon the horizon. Finally, it disappeared altogether. The men in the boats believed they had left behind their last opportunity to stand upon solid ground before South America. They could not know whether they had made the right choice. History would eventually provide the answer. But not before the Pacific demanded sacrifices almost beyond imagination. The 3 whaleboats, now carrying only 17 men, slipped away from Henderson Island under a gentle morning breeze. For a long time no one spoke. The island remained visible behind them, a small green shape rising from the endless blue Pacific. Standing along the rocky shoreline were William Wright, Seth Weeks, and Thomas Chappell. Even from a distance, the men in the boats could still make out their figures. Some waved one last time. Those on shore raised their arms in return. Neither group knew they would never see each other again. As the hours passed, Henderson Island slowly faded into the horizon until it disappeared completely. The ocean had once again become their entire world. Although they had left with fresh water and additional food gathered from the island, no one believed their situation had become easy. The officers had calculated the remaining distance as carefully as possible. They still faced thousands of miles of open ocean before reaching the coast of South America. It was an extraordinary journey for 3 small, open boats. Yet the days immediately after leaving the island felt different. The men had eaten better. Their strength had improved. For a brief time, optimism returned. Even the conversations became livelier. Some spoke about what they would do once they reached home. One sailor imagined sitting beside a warm fireplace during a Nantucket winter. Another talked about seeing his young daughter, who would have grown noticeably during his years away. Someone joked that after surviving a whale attack and crossing half the Pacific in a whaleboat, ordinary storms would never seem frightening again. The laughter was genuine, short-lived. Nature rarely allows comfort to remain for long at sea. Within several days, the weather began to change. Dark clouds gathered low along the horizon. The wind strengthened. At first, the sailors welcomed it. A stronger breeze meant faster progress. The sails filled more completely, pushing the boats steadily eastward. But experienced mariners watched the sky with concern. The clouds continued building. The air became unusually heavy. The long ocean swells grew steeper. Captain George Pollard ordered everyone to prepare. Loose supplies were secured. Water casks were tied firmly in place. The little boats rode lower than before because of the additional food collected on Henderson Island, making them even more vulnerable to heavy seas. By evening the storm arrived. The peaceful Pacific transformed with astonishing speed. Powerful winds tore across the water. The waves that had gently lifted the boats only hours earlier became towering walls of dark water. Rain lashed the exhausted sailors. The boats climbed one wave after another before plunging sharply into deep valleys between them. Every man grabbed whatever he could hold. No one slept. There was no possibility. The only goal was to keep the boats afloat. Seawater poured over the sides. Men bailed constantly using buckets, hats, and even their hands whenever necessary. If too much water accumulated inside, a boat could become dangerously unstable. Hours passed. The storm showed little mercy. Lightning occasionally flashed across the sky, briefly illuminating the enormous waves surrounding them. For an instant, the 3 boats became visible to one another. Then darkness swallowed everything again. The officers shouted commands through the roaring wind. Often, their voices disappeared before reaching the next boat. At times, each crew feared the others had vanished entirely. Young Thomas Nickerson later remembered the terrifying uncertainty. Not knowing where the other boats were proved almost as frightening as the storm itself. Every flash of lightning became precious. Each brief glimpse confirmed another boat still survived. Then darkness returned. Near midnight, one enormous wave crashed directly across Owen Chase's boat. The force nearly rolled it over. Several precious supplies were swept into the sea before anyone could stop them. The men lunged desperately toward drifting equipment, but the ocean reclaimed it almost instantly. Nothing could be recovered. Fresh water, food, tools, everything lost reduced their chances of survival. By dawn, the storm finally began moving away. The sea remained rough, but the worst had passed. The exhausted sailors looked around. Miraculously, all three boats still floated. Damaged, waterlogged, but afloat. The men immediately began inspecting their supplies. The results were discouraging. Several food containers had been soaked with seawater. Some biscuits dissolved into useless paste. Other provisions had simply disappeared during the night. Their already limited resources had become smaller still. Captain Pollard gathered the officers. The calculations were repeated. No one liked the answer. Rations would need to be reduced again. The announcement spread quietly through the boats. There were no protests. Everyone understood. The numbers allowed no argument. Each man's daily portion became even smaller than before. Hunger returned almost immediately. The brief comfort they had found on Henderson Island faded into memory. Their bodies began consuming every reserve of energy. Faces grew thinner. Cheekbones became more pronounced. Clothing, already loose from months at sea, now hung awkwardly from shrinking bodies. Beards continued growing unchecked. Salt-coated skin that had not known proper washing since the Essex sank. The transformation happened gradually enough that the men scarcely noticed it in one another. If someone from Nantucket had suddenly appeared, however, the change would have been shocking. The sailors no longer resembled the healthy whalemen who had left home over a year earlier. Still, discipline remained. Captain Pollard insisted upon fairness. Officers received no larger portions than ordinary sailors. The rule strengthened trust. Everyone endured together. Several days later, another difficulty emerged. Second mate Matthew Joy, who commanded one of the boats, became seriously ill. At first, the men believed exhaustion explained his weakness. He complained of headaches, then fever. Soon he struggled to sit upright for long periods. The exact nature of his illness remains uncertain. Modern historians have suggested several possibilities, but surviving records do not allow a definite diagnosis. Whatever the cause, his condition steadily worsened. His crew quietly assumed more of his responsibilities. Joy remained mentally aware for much of the time, offering advice whenever he could. Yet everyone saw the truth. He was becoming weaker each day. The realization weighed heavily upon the others. Until now, they had measured survival by food and distance. Now another question entered their minds. Could every man survive the journey? No one dared ask the question aloud. The Pacific itself seemed unchanged. Flying fish still occasionally skimmed across the waves. Seabirds still circled overhead from time to time. The sunsets remained breathtakingly beautiful. Nature displayed extraordinary peace while human suffering quietly deepened. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind them, Owen Chase watched the western sky glow with brilliant gold and crimson. It reminded him of evenings aboard the Essex, when such beauty had promised another ordinary day at sea. Now it served only as a reminder of everything they had lost. The whale had sunk their ship in a matter of minutes. But it was becoming painfully clear that the greatest danger had never been the attack itself. It was the long voyage that followed. And before another week had passed, the exhausted sailors would begin facing decisions that no one ever wishes to make. Decisions that would forever place the story of the Essex among the most haunting survival accounts in maritime history. The ocean has a way of changing a person's understanding of time. On land, days are measured by clocks, church bells, the opening of shops, or the familiar rhythm of family life. A sailor adrift in a small boat has none of those comforts. Time becomes sunrise and sunset. It becomes the number of biscuits remaining in a cask. It becomes the distance between one ration of water and the next. For the 17 survivors of the Essex, every morning now began with the same quiet question. How much longer could they endure? The answer grew less certain with each passing day. Their boats continued eastward whenever the wind cooperated, but progress was uneven. Sometimes a favorable breeze carried them several dozen miles in a day. At other times the ocean seemed determined to hold them in place. The Pacific was not fighting them with constant storms. It was doing something almost worse. It was simply refusing to hurry. Captain George Pollard continued navigating as carefully as circumstances allowed, using his compass and occasional celestial observations. He estimated their position each day. Owen Chase made his own calculations independently. Whenever the two officers compared notes, the results were reassuringly close. They were moving, but not fast enough. Every mile gained came at the cost of precious food and water. The reduced rations were now painfully small. A sailor could finish his entire day's meal in only a few bites. The water disappeared almost as quickly. After drinking, thirst returned within minutes. Some men tried to make their portions last longer by taking tiny sips. Others swallowed everything immediately, unable to resist. Neither method changed the outcome. The body always wanted more. Hunger gradually transformed from an unpleasant feeling into a constant companion. It was there when they woke. It remained while they watched the horizon. It followed them into restless sleep. Conversation increasingly centered on food. Not because anyone expected to find it, but because memory became its own form of comfort. One sailor described fresh bread cooling on a windowsill. Another remembered roasted beef served during holidays in Nantucket. Someone else spoke about apples picked directly from an orchard. The descriptions became astonishingly detailed. The smell, the warmth, taste. Young Thomas Nickerson listened carefully. Sometimes he closed his eyes and imagined those meals so vividly that, for a brief moment, his empty stomach almost believed them. Then reality returned. There was only another piece of hardtack, and another sip of water. Second mate Matthew Joy continued to weaken. His fever had not broken. He spoke less each day. The men in his boat watched with growing concern as even simple tasks exhausted him. Holding an oar for more than a few minutes became difficult. Standing required assistance. Still Joy remained calm. He understood the seriousness of his condition. No medicine existed aboard the boats. No doctor waited over the next horizon. The ocean offered no hospitals, only patience. The officers quietly rearranged responsibilities so Joy could rest as much as possible. No one complained. They all understood that illness could strike any one of them next. The weather remained mostly fair. To an observer on a passing ship, the scene might have appeared peaceful. 3 small boats sailing beneath blue skies. Gentle waves. Steady breeze. Nothing dramatic. Nothing alarming. Yet appearances concealed reality. The men were slowly becoming weaker. Their muscles had begun shrinking from weeks of inadequate nutrition. Simple movements required greater effort than before. Lifting a water cask. Adjusting a sail. Pulling an oar. Each task demanded energy their bodies struggled to provide. Even speaking loudly became tiring. Silence settled over the boats for longer periods. It was no longer simply peaceful. It was exhaustion. One afternoon, several dolphins appeared beside the boats. The sleek animals leaped gracefully through the water, seemingly curious about the strange visitors crossing their ocean. The sailors watched them with mixed emotions. Dolphins were beautiful. They also represented food. The men attempted to catch one using improvised methods, but the animals moved with astonishing speed. Within minutes they disappeared beneath the waves. The opportunity vanished with them. It was another reminder that nature did not always offer help when it seemed closest. That evening, dark clouds gathered once again. This time the men welcomed them. Rain meant life. Every available container was prepared before the first drops fell. The shower lasted longer than the previous one. Fresh water poured from the sky. The sailors laughed openly as they held buckets, hats, cooking pots, and even pieces of sailcloth beneath the rain. Some simply tilted back their heads and drank directly. For a few precious minutes, thirst no longer ruled their thoughts. When the clouds finally moved away, their water supply had increased enough to postpone disaster. It was one of the happiest moments since the sinking of the Essex. But relief remained temporary. Food could not be collected from the clouds. As the days continued, the officers were forced to reduce the biscuit ration yet again. No one argued. The shrinking casks spoke for themselves. The arithmetic was impossible to ignore. Every sailor received only enough to prolong survival, never enough to satisfy hunger. Their appearance changed further. Sunlight darkened their skin. Salt cracked their lips until they bled. Hair and beards grew long and tangled. Clothing became worn from constant exposure to seawater. Hands that had once possessed the strength to throw heavy harpoons now trembled after prolonged effort. Thomas Nickerson later remembered looking at some of the older sailors and barely recognizing them. The transformation had happened gradually. The ocean had reshaped them one day at a time. Captain Pollard made every effort to preserve order. Each morning he encouraged the men. Each evening he reminded them that every mile carried them closer to South America. His words remained steady, though privately he understood how uncertain their future had become. No officer could promise rescue. He could only promise leadership. Owen Chase spent increasing amounts of time studying the horizon. Years of whaling had trained his eyes to notice distant movement. Sometimes he believed he saw a sail. Minutes later it became only a cloud. Other times he imagined land. It dissolved into haze. The ocean created endless illusions. Hope itself became difficult to trust. Then, as November gave way to December, another tragedy approached quietly. Matthew Joy's condition worsened rapidly. The fever that had weakened him for days now left him barely able to speak. The men around him did everything they could. They shared what little comfort remained available. They shaded him from the harsh afternoon sun whenever possible. They offered encouraging words. But they could not change the course of his illness. The sea offered no mercy. One cold morning, as the boats continued their lonely passage across the Pacific, the survivors realized they were no longer fighting only hunger and thirst. For the first time since the Essex had disappeared beneath the waves, death itself had quietly entered one of the boats. And before many more sunrises had passed, the number of survivors would no longer be 17. Morning broke beneath a pale sky. The sea was unusually calm, disturbed only by long, gentle swells that rolled beneath the three whaleboats. Under different circumstances, the weather would have been welcomed. There was no dangerous wind, no towering waves, no driving rain, yet no one noticed the beauty. All eyes were fixed upon second mate Matthew Joy. For several days his strength had faded steadily. The fever that had first appeared as a weakness had become something far more serious. He now spoke only in whispers. Even lifting his head required effort. The men sharing his boat understood what was happening long before anyone said it aloud. There was nothing left to do except remain beside him. Captain George Pollard and Owen Chase could offer no medicine, no physician, no treatment. In 1820, even aboard a fully equipped ship, medical knowledge at sea remained limited. In 3 open whaleboats drifting thousands of miles from land, there was almost nothing available beyond fresh water, rest, and hope. Hope was running out. The crew shaded Joy from the relentless tropical sun as best they could with scraps of sailcloth. Someone moistened his lips with a few drops of water. Another adjusted the blanket beneath him. The gestures were small. They were also acts of quiet compassion. No one wanted a shipmate to feel alone. During moments when the fever eased slightly, Joy remained calm. He understood the reality better than anyone. He had spent years at sea. He knew what survival demanded. He knew the ocean often refused second chances. Those around him later remembered that he accepted his condition with remarkable dignity. There was no anger, no panic, only exhaustion. The boats continued drifting eastward. Stopping was impossible. Every hour mattered. The officers faced an impossible balance. They could not abandon a sick companion. Neither could they sacrifice the remaining lives by delaying their journey. So they sailed on. The sea carried both the living and the dying together. Late that day, Matthew Joy died. His passing was quiet. No dramatic final speech survives in the historical record. No famous last words were written down. Only silence. One moment he still breathed. The next he did not. For several minutes, the men around him simply remained still. The reality settled over them slowly. The Essex had now claimed its first life since the sinking. Not through the whale, not through drowning, but through the relentless hardships that followed. The loss reached every boat. Although separated by short distances, the three crews communicated the news. Conversation nearly disappeared. Matthew Joy had been respected throughout the voyage. His experience, his calm judgment, his steady leadership, all were now gone. The officers faced another painful duty. There could be no burial on land. Land remained impossibly distant. Like countless sailors before him, Joy would receive a burial at sea. The ceremony reflected both necessity and tradition. The men gathered as closely as circumstances allowed. Prayers were spoken. Voices were quiet, carried gently across the calm Pacific. Then Matthew Joy's body was committed to the ocean. The sea that had shaped his life now became his final resting place. The boats remained motionless for a few moments afterward. No one hurried to leave. Eventually the sails filled once more. The voyage continued. It had to. The living still depended upon reaching land. Yet something had changed inside every survivor. Until now, death had remained a possibility. Now it had become reality. Every sailor understood that he might be next. Hunger deepened. The reduced rations barely sustained life. Each biscuit was broken into carefully measured portions. No crumbs were wasted. The days after Matthew Joy's burial at sea seemed to blend together, until even the most experienced sailors struggled to remember one sunrise from another. The Pacific remained immense. The horizon remained empty. The wind came and went according to its own mysterious rhythm. For the survivors of the Essex, life had been reduced to a handful of necessities. Keep the boats afloat. Protect the remaining water. Measure the food. Watch the horizon. Survive one more day. That simple routine demanded every ounce of strength they had left. The officers recalculated their position whenever the weather allowed. Captain George Pollard spread the surviving charts as carefully as possible across his knees, protecting them from spray while making observations. Owen Chase checked the figures independently. The calculations offered both encouragement and concern. They had indeed traveled a remarkable distance since leaving Henderson Island. Yet the coast of South America still lay far beyond the eastern horizon. Farther than any of the men wished to admit. No one complained openly. There seemed little purpose. The ocean did not negotiate. It did not care about exhaustion or determination. Simply existed. The reduced rations had begun changing the men in ways more serious than appearance alone. Their thoughts slowed. Simple conversations required greater concentration. Several sailors found themselves forgetting ordinary words. Others stared silently at the sea for long stretches without realizing how much time had passed. Hunger was no longer merely physical. It affected the mind. The body searched constantly for energy that no longer existed. Thomas Nickerson later remembered that even climbing carefully from one end of the boat to the other became tiring. His legs, once strong from working aboard the Essex, had grown noticeably weaker. He could still perform his duties. They simply required much more effort. The older sailors suffered similarly. No one escaped the slow effects of starvation. The weather remained mostly favorable, although favorable had acquired a different meaning. The men no longer wished for swift winds that might produce dangerous seas, nor did they welcome complete calm. They desired only enough breeze to move steadily eastward without threatening the overloaded boats. Such conditions arrived only occasionally. On several afternoons, the wind disappeared almost entirely. The patched sails sagged uselessly. The boats drifted with the current. The ocean became strangely smooth, beautiful, silent, almost motionless. To someone standing safely on shore, it might have seemed like paradise. To the survivors, it was another reminder that every hour without progress consumed supplies they could never replace. When the breeze finally returned, the boats moved once more. Every slight ripple in the sails lifted morale. Motion meant possibility. Still, there were moments when nature offered unexpected gifts. One morning, a school of small fish gathered beneath the boats. The sailors quickly fashioned crude fishing lines from whatever materials remained available. Hooks were improvised with remarkable ingenuity. After several attempts, they managed to catch a few fish. The catch was modest. It could not satisfy everyone's hunger. Yet every fresh mouthful mattered. The fish were divided with extraordinary fairness. No man received noticeably more than another. Captain Pollard watched carefully to ensure the portions remained equal. His leadership continued to rest upon justice rather than privilege. The sailors respected him for it. Several seabirds also circled overhead during those days. Their appearance raised cautious hope. Birds sometimes suggested land. But experienced whalers knew better than to celebrate too quickly. Water remained equally precious. Even after collecting rain, the officers knew supplies would never last the entire journey unless extraordinary luck intervened. The physical effects became increasingly severe. The men's faces had grown hollow. Their shoulders narrowed beneath loose clothing. Muscles that had once hauled heavy whale blubber aboard the Essex weakened noticeably. Rowing became exhausting. Standing required concentration. Several sailors found themselves dizzy whenever they rose too quickly. Thomas Nickerson later remembered looking into the water and seeing a reflection he scarcely recognized. The cheerful 14-year-old cabin boy who had sailed from Nantucket had disappeared. In his place stared a thin, weathered face marked by salt, sun, and constant hunger. Despite everything discipline held, Captain Pollard continued dividing rations equally. He refused every temptation to favor officers. His own portions matched those of ordinary sailors. The example mattered. Fairness remained one of the few things entirely under human control. Nature controlled the weather, the wind, the waves. The officers could still control justice. Several days later, another problem emerged. One of the boats had begun leaking more seriously than before. The constant pounding from waves, combined with weeks of exposure, had loosened parts of the wooden hull. The men bailed continuously. During calmer weather the leak remained manageable, but everyone knew another major storm could become disastrous. Repairs were attempted using spare materials rescued from the Essex. Bits of wood, bluff, pitch where any remained. The work slowed the leak. It did not eliminate it. Every few hours someone still had to remove accumulated seawater. It became another exhausting task added to an already impossible journey. The weather alternated between brilliant sunshine and brief rain showers. The rain remained welcome. The sun did not. During midday, the heat became nearly unbearable. The exposed boats reflected light from every direction. There was almost nowhere to hide. Skin blistered despite months of exposure. Eyes ached from staring across dazzling water. Night brought relief from the heat but introduced another hardship. cold. Without adequate food, the human body struggled to maintain warmth. Many sailors shivered until dawn despite wrapping themselves in whatever clothing remained dry. Sleep came only in short intervals. Dreams often felt more vivid than waking life. Several men spoke quietly about their families. Others stopped mentioning home altogether. The memories had become too painful. Still no ships appeared. Every morning began with careful observation of the horizon. Every evening ended with disappointment. The Pacific remained almost unimaginably empty. Modern shipping lanes did not yet exist. Steamships had not transformed ocean travel. A vessel could spend weeks crossing these waters without encountering another. The survivors knew this, yet they searched anyway. Hope demanded it. As December advanced, their calculations became increasingly grim. The remaining food would not carry 17 men to South America. The officers understood the numbers. They also understood there was no alternative route left. Turning back toward Henderson Island was impossible. Continuing forward remained the only choice. The ocean had reduced survival to simple arithmetic. Distance, food, water. Only one of those could not be measured precisely. Time itself. Because none of the exhausted sailors could know how many days remained before rescue, or how many remained before desperation would force choices almost beyond human imagination. Those choices would soon confront the survivors. And history has never forgotten what happened next. Many ocean birds traveled enormous distances without approaching shore. Still, every bird sparked quiet conversation. Could land be nearer than expected? Had they unknowingly entered different waters? Each evening the horizon answered with silence. There was only ocean. The leaking boat demanded constant attention. Its crew rotated the exhausting task of bailing. Hour after hour, someone removed seawater before it accumulated dangerously. The labor consumed precious energy. Yet allowing the water to rise even a few inches risked disaster. No one complained. The work simply had to be done. As December continued, another change became noticeable. The men no longer discussed future whaling voyages. Earlier in the ordeal, several had spoken about returning to sea after reaching home. Now those conversations disappeared. Home itself had become the only dream. No one cared about fortunes earned from whale oil. No one mentioned promotions or profitable expeditions. The ambitions that had once filled their conversations had been stripped away by hunger. Simple survival had replaced every other goal. One evening, Owen Chase found himself remembering the day the Essex had sailed from Nantucket. He could almost picture the crowded docks, the smell of fresh-cut timber, children running beside the harbor, families waving farewell. The memory felt impossibly distant. It belonged almost to another lifetime. He wondered how many people back home still believed the Essex was safely hunting whales somewhere in the Pacific. No one in Nantucket yet knew disaster had struck. Wives continued waiting. Parents continued hoping. Children expected fathers to return with stories from distant oceans. Across thousands of miles, ordinary life continued untouched. The contrast was almost impossible to imagine. One afternoon, a large shark appeared beneath one of the boats. Its gray shape moved slowly through the clear water before circling once and disappearing into the depths. The sight unsettled everyone, not because sharks were uncommon. Whalers encountered them frequently. Rather, the appearance reminded the sailors of their vulnerability. Only a few inches of weathered wood separated them from the vast ocean beneath. Another storm. Another damaged hull. Another accident. Any of these could place a man directly into those waters. The shark vanished as quietly as it had appeared. But its memory lingered. Captain Pollard noticed increasing fatigue among the crews. Simple tasks required encouragement. Rowing for even short periods left men breathing heavily. The body could not perform demanding labor without nourishment. He worried privately that they might soon lack the strength necessary to handle another major storm. Yet there was little he could do. Food remained scarce. Water remained limited. Leadership alone could not replace calories. As the sun set that evening, the western sky burned brilliant gold before fading gradually into deep purple. The ocean reflected every color. For a few peaceful moments, the scene possessed extraordinary beauty. Several sailors watched quietly. One finally spoke. "If only we were seeing this from the deck of the Essex." No one answered. There was nothing to add. The silence itself became agreement. Days later, the officers examined the remaining food once again. The result confirmed their greatest fear. Even with the strictest rationing, their supplies were nearly exhausted. There would soon come a day when the casks were empty. No calculations could change that fact. The men did not yet know exactly when that day would arrive. But it was approaching, slowly, relentlessly, like the steady rise of the sun each morning. And once the last biscuit disappeared, the survivors would be forced into the darkest chapter of the Essex tragedy. A chapter documented in the journals and testimonies of the men themselves, and one that historians have studied with great care ever since. The final biscuits disappeared more quickly than anyone wanted to admit. For weeks, the officers had stretched the provisions with remarkable discipline. Every ration had been measured carefully. Every crumb had been saved. Every opportunity to gather fish or seabirds had been seized without hesitation. Even so, arithmetic could not be defeated. Eventually, there was almost nothing left to divide. Captain George Pollard opened the remaining food cask one morning and looked inside. The bottom was nearly bare. The men gathered quietly. No one expected good news. There wasn't any. The last portions were broken into equal pieces and distributed among the crews. Each sailor accepted his share without complaint. It was astonishingly small. Many finished it in only a few bites. When the meal ended, they understood something had changed forever. There would be no breakfast tomorrow. Not unless the sea provided it. Hunger, which had remained a constant companion for weeks, soon deepened into something far more severe. The body began consuming itself. Every movement became slower. Every task required conscious effort. The sailors' faces had grown so thin that the bones beneath the skin stood out clearly. Their eyes seemed larger, not because they had changed, but because everything else had diminished. Beards covered hollow cheeks. Their clothes, already worn by months of salt water and sun, now hung loosely from shoulders that had lost much of their strength. Thomas Nickerson later recalled that he could count the ribs beneath his own skin. At 14 years old, he had become almost unrecognizable. The Pacific remained strangely generous in one respect. Occasionally, fish still appeared. The survivors watched constantly for any sign of life beneath the water. Whenever a fish came within reach, several hands moved at once. Sometimes they succeeded. Often they did not. The catches became smaller and less frequent. The birds that occasionally circled overhead also grew more difficult to catch. Every missed opportunity carried greater weight than before. The difference between eating and not eating might now depend upon a single bird. Fresh water had become the next concern. Rain had helped several times during the voyage, but rainfall could never be predicted. The casks steadily grew lighter. The officers reduced the daily allowance once again. The decision was unavoidable. Each man now received only enough water to keep his body functioning for another day. The thirst became almost unbearable. Lips split and bled. Tongue swelled. Speaking for long periods felt uncomfortable. Many sailors stopped talking altogether, saving their energy for more necessary tasks. Silence settled across the boats more completely than ever before. There were moments when an entire afternoon passed without more than a few words. Only the sound of water against the hulls interrupted the stillness. Captain Pollard continued encouraging the men whenever possible. He reminded them they had already survived dangers few people could imagine. They had escaped a whale attack. They had survived the sinking of the Essex. They had crossed an astonishing distance in open boats. Surely, he suggested, they could survive a little longer. His words were sincere. Whether he fully believed them himself remains impossible to know. Leadership sometimes requires hope even when certainty has vanished. Owen Chase occupied himself with practical tasks. He inspected the boats repeatedly, checked the sails, studied the weather, anything that kept his mind focused upon action rather than despair. Several sailors followed his example. Work, however small, distracted the mind from hunger. One afternoon, clouds gathered once more. Every face turned upward. Rain. They needed rain. The first drops brought immediate excitement. Buckets were raised. Pieces of sailcloth stretched into makeshift collectors. Some men simply opened their mouths toward the sky. The shower remained frustratingly brief. Enough water fell to replenish their supply slightly. Not enough to remove their worries. When the clouds drifted away, disappointment quietly returned. Another opportunity had come and gone. As December advanced, strange effects of prolonged starvation became increasingly noticeable. Several survivors later described vivid dreams while awake. They imagined meals waiting before them. They believed they heard familiar voices calling from somewhere beyond the horizon. Sometimes a sailor stared toward empty water, convinced another ship had appeared. The illusion vanished after a closer look. The mind, deprived of proper nourishment, struggled to separate hope from reality. Thomas Nickerson later admitted that he sometimes imagined walking through the streets of Nantucket. He could almost hear footsteps upon wooden sidewalks. He could almost smell bread baking. Then the rocking of the boat reminded him where he truly was. The contrast felt almost cruel. The officers noticed another problem. Several men had become too weak to row effectively. Their hands blistered more easily. Their muscles cramped after only short periods of work. Responsibilities had to be shifted continually as strength faded unevenly among the crews. No one escaped entirely. Some simply weakened more slowly than others. The leaking boat demanded constant attention as before. Bailing remained essential. The men performed the task almost mechanically now. They had repeated the same motion so many times that it required little thought. Scoop, lift, throw, again, again, again. Every bucket of seawater removed represented another chance to continue living. The weather remained unusually fair. Historians have often remarked upon this cruel irony. Violent storms might have destroyed the boats. Instead, calm seas prolonged the ordeal. The survivors drifted steadily onward through beautiful weather while starvation slowly tightened its grip. The Pacific offered breathtaking sunsets almost every evening. Brilliant gold, deep crimson, soft purple. Colors reflected across water so smooth it resembled polished glass. Several sailors stopped looking. Beauty had become difficult to appreciate. It reminded them only of how indifferent nature could be. One evening, Owen Chase quietly estimated the remaining distance once again. Even under favorable conditions, land remained farther away than their bodies seemed capable of enduring. He shared the calculations with Captain Pollard. The two men spoke softly so others could not hear. Neither wished to spread unnecessary fear, but both understood the same terrible truth. Time was running out. Not because of storms. Not because of whales. Not because the boats were sinking. Time itself had become the enemy. Each sunrise consumed another day. Each sunset found them weaker than before. The survivors still believed rescue remained possible. They still watched the horizon every morning. They still adjusted their sails. They still followed the compass eastward. Yet beneath that determination, another realization slowly began taking shape. If no ship appeared soon, if no unexpected source of food presented itself, the choices before them would become almost impossible. And within only a matter of days, those impossible choices would no longer remain theoretical. They would become the desperate reality faced by 17 exhausted men drifting across the vast Pacific Ocean. By the middle of December, the Pacific no longer felt merely vast, felt endless. Every sunrise revealed the same unbroken circle of water. Every evening ended with the same empty horizon. The survivors of the Essex had crossed an extraordinary distance since their ship disappeared beneath the waves, yet they remained surrounded by nothing except sea and sky. The ocean offered no sign that civilization existed anywhere beyond the horizon. The boats had grown quieter than ever before. Conversation required energy. Energy required food. Food no longer existed. Most of the men now spoke only when necessary. Simple instructions passed between the crews. A warning about a wave. A request to adjust the sail. A reminder to check the water casks. Beyond those practical words, silence filled the hours. The sound of seawater against the wooden hulls became strangely familiar. It was the only constant companion. Captain George Pollard continued maintaining the discipline that had carried them this far. Every morning began with careful inspection of the boats. Every afternoon the officers checked their course. Every evening they calculated what little remained of their supplies. The water casks were becoming dangerously light. Even after collecting rain whenever possible, the amount remaining could not last forever. The officers measured every ration with extraordinary care. No one received even a mouthful more than another. The fairness mattered. Without it, trust might disappear. Without trust, 17 exhausted men in 3 open boats could quickly become 17 desperate individuals. Despite the worsening conditions, the survivors continued helping one another whenever possible. If one sailor became too weak to adjust a sail, another stepped forward. If someone struggled to bail water from a leaking boat, tired hands still reached to help. The hardships had not destroyed their humanity. They had strengthened it. Thomas Nickerson later remembered small acts of kindness more clearly than many of the larger events. A sailor offering another the slightly drier place to sit during a cold night. Someone quietly sharing a tiny piece of fish caught by chance. Another adjusting a blanket over a sleeping companion. These gestures cost almost nothing. Yet they meant everything. The weather remained remarkably calm. The sun rose each morning with relentless certainty. Its warmth soon became oppressive. The boats had almost no protection from direct sunlight. The men's skin darkened further beneath months of exposure. Salt dried across their faces. Their hands, once rough from years of work, had become cracked and swollen. Even lifting an oar left several of them trembling. The body had begun conserving every remaining reserve. Movements became slow and deliberate. Nothing was wasted. One afternoon, a small group of seabirds circled overhead. Every man watched them. Birds often rested upon the water before continuing their flight. If one landed close enough, it might provide desperately needed nourishment. The survivors waited patiently. For several minutes the birds circled lower. Then, almost without warning, they turned away and disappeared into the distance. No one spoke. Disappointment no longer required words. It simply settled quietly over the boats before another day continued. The nights had become especially difficult. Without sufficient food, the men struggled to stay warm after sunset. The tropical Pacific could still become surprisingly cool once darkness arrived. Clothing remained damp from spray. The wind carried moisture that chilled already weakened bodies. Sleep came only in short intervals. Many awoke shivering. Others remained awake altogether, watching unfamiliar constellations drift slowly across the sky. Several sailors quietly prayed. Some prayed for rescue. Others prayed simply for strength to face another sunrise. Faith became deeply personal during those endless nights. No one questioned another man's beliefs. The ocean humbled everyone equally. Captain Pollard continued scanning the horizon each morning with his spyglass. It had become almost a ritual. Every distant cloud received careful attention. Every unusual shape invited hope. Again and again the answer proved the same. No ships. The Pacific shipping routes of 1820 were nothing like those of the modern world. Entire weeks could pass without one vessel crossing another's path. The survivors understood this better than anyone. Yet they looked anyway. Hope survived long after reason suggested otherwise. As starvation tightened its grip, the men's thoughts increasingly drifted toward home. One sailor quietly described the harbor at Nantucket during autumn. Another remembered hearing church bells on Sunday mornings. Someone else spoke about the smell of fresh coffee prepared before dawn. The memories became astonishingly vivid. Ordinary moments acquired extraordinary value. The survivors were not remembering celebrations. They remembered simple life. A chair beside a fire, clean bed, a loaf of bread, conversation with family. Things unnoticed in comfort became precious in suffering. Thomas Nickerson found himself thinking often about his mother. He wondered whether she still believed the Essex was somewhere in the Pacific filling barrels with whale oil. He imagined her waiting patiently for news that would not arrive for many months. The thought filled him with determination. He wanted to survive, not simply for himself, for home, for family, for everyone waiting across the ocean. But determination could not replace nourishment. Several men now struggled to stand without assistance. Their muscles had weakened dramatically. One sailor fainted briefly while attempting to adjust part of the rigging. The others helped him recover as best they could. There was little else to offer. Water, encouragement, rest, nothing more. Late one afternoon, Owen Chase quietly studied the remaining water. He knew the numbers almost by memory now. Even with the strictest discipline, they could not continue indefinitely. The calculations had become unavoidable. Food was gone. Water was disappearing. The distance remained immense. The officers exchanged worried glances but spoke little. There were no encouraging figures left to share. Only uncertainty. As the sun slipped beneath the western horizon that evening, the sea became almost perfectly calm. The boats drifted silently across water so smooth it reflected the first stars of night. It was a scene of breathtaking beauty, almost peaceful. Yet beneath that peaceful sky, every man aboard understood that they had reached the edge of endurance. They had survived storms. They had survived the whale. They had survived the sinking of the Essex. Now they faced an enemy far more patient. The slow exhaustion of the human body itself. And before many more days had passed, the surviving officers would confront a decision so painful that generations of historians would continue discussing it more than 2 centuries later. The Pacific remained calm. There were no towering waves crashing against the boats. No violent storms tearing at the patched sails. No lightning splitting the night sky. Instead, there was something far more relentless. Silence. The kind of silence that stretches over an ocean where nothing changes from one hour to the next. For the survivors of the Essex, that silence had become almost unbearable. The wind continued carrying the boats eastward, but far too slowly. Every morning Captain George Pollard and Owen Chase repeated the same routine. They checked the compass. They estimated the distance traveled. They studied the sky. Then they looked toward the empty horizon. Every day ended with the same conclusion. They were still alone. By now, starvation had progressed beyond ordinary hunger. The men's bodies had begun consuming every remaining reserve of fat and muscle. Their faces had become deeply hollow. Their clothing hung loosely from shoulders that had once hauled heavy whale blubber aboard the Essex. Even their voices had changed. Speaking loudly required effort. Many conversations took place in little more than whispers. Thomas Nickerson later remembered how unusual everyone's eyes appeared. The faces around them had grown so thin that the eyes seemed larger than before. Not brighter, simply more prominent. They reflected exhaustion more than hope. Even so, the discipline that had carried them across so much of the Pacific still remained. No one stole another man's water. No one secretly hid food. Captain Pollard insisted that every remaining drop of fresh water continue to be measured equally. The officers accepted exactly the same allowance as the ordinary sailors. It was a small detail. It mattered enormously. Trust still existed. Without it, the boats could not have remained united. The leaking whaleboat continued demanding constant attention. Every few hours someone leaned over with a bucket, carefully lifting seawater back into the Pacific. The task had become exhausting. Men who once rowed for hours without complaint now struggled after only a few minutes of work. Arms trembled. Breathing became heavy. Simple labor left them completely drained. Owen Chase noticed these changes with growing concern. He understood that another major storm could prove impossible to survive. The boats themselves might endure. The men no longer possessed the strength they once had. The weather, however, remained deceptively kind. Blue skies stretched from one horizon to the other. Occasional clouds drifted overhead without bringing rain. The sunlight reflected brilliantly from the ocean, forcing the sailors to narrow their eyes throughout the day. Their skin had become rough from months of salt and wind. Their lips were deeply cracked. Every swallow reminded them how little water remained. One afternoon, several flying fish landed unexpectedly inside Pollard's boat. The men reacted instantly. Weak hands still moved with surprising speed when food appeared. The catch was small, only a few fish. Yet those few fish represented the first meaningful nourishment many had received in days. The officers divided them with extraordinary care. Every man received a piece. No portion seemed generous. No one expected it to be. Still, the fresh meat briefly restored both strength and spirits. For a short while, conversation returned. Someone remarked that perhaps fortune had not abandoned them entirely. Another suggested the fish might indicate changing waters closer to South America. No one knew whether that was true. Hope often grows from very little. As evening approached, clouds gathered along the eastern horizon. Every eye watched them carefully. Rain. They desperately needed rain. The clouds thickened. The wind shifted slightly. Nothing. The clouds slowly drifted away without releasing a single drop. The disappointment settled heavily across the boats. Even nature seemed unwilling to decide quickly whether it would help or hinder them. That night, sleep became especially difficult. Several sailors later described unusually vivid dreams. Some dreamed of walking through Nantucket. Others imagined themselves once again aboard the Essex, believing for a few wonderful moments that nothing terrible had happened. Thomas Nickerson dreamed of sitting at his family's table while his mother served a simple evening meal. Fresh bread, warm soup, butter. He reached for the bread, then awakened suddenly. His hand closed only upon the rough wooden side of the boat. The contrast left him staring silently into the darkness. The stars above appeared almost impossibly bright. They had guided sailors for centuries. Now they seemed to watch without offering answers. The following morning brought another difficult realization. Several of the survivors could no longer contribute equally to rowing or managing the sails. Their bodies had become too weak. Captain Pollard quietly reorganized responsibilities once again. Those with slightly more strength accepted additional work. No one complained. Everyone understood that tomorrow the situation might be reversed. Starvation spared no one. It merely arrived at different speeds. The officers also began discussing the remaining water more frequently. The casks had become frighteningly light. Each time a ration was measured, the sound inside the barrel changed. There was less water striking the wooden sides. Less hope. The arithmetic had become impossible to ignore. Even if favorable winds continued, even if no storms appeared, even if every boat remained afloat, the supply of fresh water would soon be exhausted. The realization settled over everyone gradually. No dramatic announcement was necessary. The sailors could see the nearly empty casks themselves. Late that afternoon, a distant object appeared on the horizon. Every man who still possessed enough strength struggled to look. Was it a ship? Several believed it was. Others remained cautious. The object remained barely visible for nearly an hour. Hope quietly spread through the boats. If another vessel had finally appeared, everything could change. The officers watched through the surviving spyglass whenever possible. Minute by minute, the shape became clearer. Then the truth emerged. It was not a ship. only an unusually shaped cloud sitting low above the water. No one spoke for several minutes afterward. The disappointment was almost physical. Hope had risen so quickly. It disappeared just as fast. As darkness approached, Owen Chase quietly admitted to Captain Pollard that they had entered the most dangerous stage of the entire ordeal. The whale attack had lasted only moments. The sinking had lasted only hours. What they faced now threatened to last much longer. The human body can endure remarkable hardship, but it cannot survive indefinitely without nourishment. The officers understood what the coming days might demand. Neither wished to speak those thoughts aloud. Yet history records that by this point, the survivors had reached a desperate condition unlike anything they had ever imagined possible. And before another sunrise passed, the first discussions of choices no sailor ever wished to consider would begin quietly among the exhausted crews. The dawn arrived without ceremony. No brilliant sunrise seemed capable of lifting the weight that had settled over the 3 whaleboats. The sea rolled gently beneath them, almost peaceful, while 17 exhausted men drifted farther across the Pacific than any of them had ever imagined possible. For a long time no one spoke. The silence was no longer simply the result of discipline. It was weakness. Even conversation required strength that starvation had steadily taken away. The officers continued their routines because routine itself provided purpose. Captain George Pollard checked the compass. Owen Chase examined the sails and the condition of the boats. The leaking hull still demanded frequent bailing, though the men performing the work now paused more often to catch their breath. Every task had become slower, every movement more deliberate. The water casks were opened once again. Only a small amount remained. The officers measured each ration with extraordinary care, ensuring every survivor received exactly the same portion. No one questioned the fairness. No one asked for more. The men understood there simply was no more to give. After drinking, many held the empty cups for a moment before setting them down. The brief relief disappeared almost immediately. Their mouths became dry again within minutes. The tropical sun climbed higher. Its warmth reflected from every direction as the ocean shimmered beneath it. The survivors wrapped scraps of cloth around their heads whenever possible, trying to shield themselves from the relentless light. Those scraps provided little protection. Months of exposure had left their skin deeply weathered. Salt had settled into every crack and blister. Their hands bore the marks of constant labor, though there was now far less strength behind them. Thomas Nickerson later remembered that simply lifting a bucket of seawater from the bottom of the boat had become exhausting. He had begun the voyage as an energetic 14-year-old cabin boy. Now he felt decades older. His thoughts often drifted home. He imagined walking through the streets of Nantucket. He pictured ordinary mornings that once seemed unremarkable. The sound of footsteps, the smell of breakfast cooking, the comfort of knowing where the next meal would come from. Those memories had become almost more vivid than the world around him. One sailor quietly described the harbor after a winter snowfall. Another remembered repairing fishing nets with his father. Someone smiled faintly while recalling a family celebration years before. No one interrupted. The stories were not complaints. They were reminders of what waited if they survived. Hope had become deeply personal. For some, it was a wife waiting patiently. For others, children they longed to see again. For Thomas, it was simply home. That afternoon, a few seabirds appeared in the distance. The men watched them carefully. The birds circled for several minutes before disappearing toward the horizon. No one knew whether they had come from land or were simply roaming the open ocean. Still, their appearance encouraged fresh discussion. Perhaps the coast was closer than their calculations suggested. Perhaps another island lay somewhere beyond sight. The officers listened but remained cautious. Navigation offered no certainty. Ocean currents, changing winds, and imperfect observations all affected their estimates. False confidence could be as dangerous as despair. The wind strengthened slightly before evening, allowing the boats to make better progress. The patched sails filled steadily. The little craft rose and fell with the swells, continuing their long journey eastward. Every mile mattered. Every hour mattered. Yet the officers privately understood that distance alone would not determine the outcome. Their greatest concern had become the condition of the men themselves. Several survivors now struggled to remain alert throughout the day. Exhaustion frequently overcame them. One man would close his eyes for only a moment before another gently woke him, worried he might slip into unconsciousness. No one wished to lose another companion. The memory of Matthew Joy remained fresh. His quiet burial at sea had reminded every survivor how fragile their own lives had become. As darkness settled over the Pacific, the stars emerged one by one. The night sky was breathtaking. Without cities or artificial light, countless stars stretched from horizon to horizon. For generations, sailors had trusted those same stars to guide them across unknown oceans. Captain Pollard used them whenever conditions allowed to confirm his course. Tonight they shone with perfect clarity. The heavens seemed orderly. The lives below them did not. Owen Chase remained awake longer than usual. He studied the eastern horizon where South America still lay far beyond sight. He reviewed the figures in his mind once again. The calculations had not changed. Their progress had been real. But so had the relentless decline in their strength. The survivors had now endured weeks in open boats after the sinking of the Essex. Every decision made since then had been guided by one purpose: preserving as many lives as possible. The officers knew that the days immediately ahead would demand calm judgment under circumstances almost impossible to imagine. Later historical accounts written by Chase, Thomas Nickerson, and other surviving evidence describe this period with remarkable honesty. They record not only the physical hardships of starvation and thirst, but also the immense emotional burden carried by men trying to preserve their humanity while facing conditions few people have ever experienced. As another quiet night passed across the Pacific, the boats continued eastward beneath the stars. The coastline they sought remained hidden beyond the horizon. The survivors held tightly to discipline, fairness, and hope. Soon, however, the ordeal would reach its most difficult stage, testing every conviction they possessed and leaving behind a historical record that continues to be studied more than 2 centuries later. Another sunrise came. The survivors no longer greeted the morning with optimism or disappointment. They simply accepted it. Each new day meant they were still alive. It also meant another day without enough food. The 3 whaleboats continued their slow passage across the Pacific, their patched sails pulling them eastward whenever the wind cooperated. The sea remained remarkably calm, almost gentle, as though it had forgotten the violence of the whale that had destroyed the Essex weeks earlier. Nature showed no memory. The men did. Captain George Pollard woke before most of the others. Even after weeks of hunger, habit remained stronger than exhaustion. He checked the sky, the wind, and the compass before quietly examining the water casks. The sound inside them had changed again. When he lifted one, there was almost no weight left. He said nothing immediately. The other officers already knew. They had watched the supply disappear one careful ration at a time. Every decision since the sinking had been intended to make those few remaining gallons last as long as possible. Now there was very little left to preserve. The morning ration was measured. Each man received only a few mouthfuls. The water disappeared almost before it reached their stomachs. No one lingered over it. There was nothing to savor. Thirst returned almost immediately. The sun climbed higher. By midday, the heat pressed down upon the boats with relentless intensity. The men covered their heads with scraps of cloth whenever possible. Some dipped pieces of fabric into seawater and laid them across their shoulders, hoping the brief evaporation would cool their skin. The relief lasted only a few minutes. Salt soon dried across the cloth once again. Thomas Nickerson found himself staring into the water beside the boat. The Pacific appeared impossibly clear. Small fish occasionally darted beneath the surface. Sometimes he watched them for several minutes, almost forgetting his own condition. The fish seemed untouched by worry. They moved freely through a world that had become a prison for the men floating above them. A few of the survivors attempted fishing again. Improvised hooks were lowered into the sea. The lines drifted quietly. Hours passed. Nothing. Finally, one small fish struck. It was hardly enough to satisfy anyone. Yet the catch was welcomed with genuine gratitude. The fish was divided carefully. Every survivor received only the smallest portion. The taste disappeared almost instantly. Its memory lasted much longer. The boats had grown noticeably quieter during recent days. Earlier in the voyage, the men had shared stories from home. They had spoken about Nantucket, family gatherings, and successful whaling expeditions. Those conversations became less frequent now. Not because the memories had faded, because speaking about them demanded emotional strength that was becoming difficult to find. Several sailors instead sat silently, watching the horizon. Hope had become something private. Captain Pollard continued offering calm encouragement whenever possible. He reminded the men that favorable winds had carried them steadily eastward. He urged them to remain disciplined. He praised those who continued working despite their weakness. His words mattered. Leadership during hardship is often measured not by grand speeches, but by quiet consistency. Owen Chase devoted much of the day to inspecting the boats. The leaking hull remained a concern. The repairs made weeks earlier still held, but only because the crew continued bailing seawater at regular intervals. Even this simple task had become difficult. The men performing it paused frequently to catch their breath. Their arms tired quickly. The body cannot maintain physical labor indefinitely without nourishment. Historical accounts written after the rescue describe how dramatically starvation affected everyone's strength during this period. Simple movements became exhausting. Standing required balance and concentration. Many sailors experienced dizziness whenever they moved too quickly. Despite these hardships, discipline remained remarkably strong. No fighting broke out. No mutiny occurred. No survivor attempted to seize another man's ration. Historians have often noted the extraordinary order maintained among the Essex survivors, even as conditions deteriorated beyond anything they had imagined. Late in the afternoon, clouds appeared across the western sky. The men watched carefully. Rain had become one of their greatest hopes. Fresh water meant another chance. The breeze shifted. The clouds grew darker. For nearly an hour they seemed to promise relief. Then gradually, they passed without releasing more than a few scattered drops. The disappointment settled heavily over the boats. Those few drops barely dampened the wooden planks. They could not be collected. Nature had once again offered hope without fulfillment. As evening approached, the Pacific became almost perfectly calm. The sea reflected the setting sun so clearly that the boats appeared suspended between two skies. It was one of those rare sights sailors remembered for the rest of their lives. Had the circumstances been different, someone might have called it beautiful. Instead, the survivors simply watched in silence. Beauty had become difficult to separate from suffering. That night, several men dreamed vividly. Thomas Nickerson later recalled dreams so realistic that awakening became almost painful. In one, he was back aboard the Essex before the whale attack. The ship was whole. The crew laughed while preparing for another day's hunt. He could hear the familiar creaking of the timbers and the steady flap of the sails. Then he opened his eyes. Only 3 small boats remained. The dream vanished. The stars overhead offered no explanation. Captain Pollard remained awake longer than usual. He quietly reviewed the navigation once more. His calculations suggested they had crossed an astonishing distance since leaving Henderson Island. Yet the coast of South America still had not appeared. He understood what this meant. The officers had delayed discussing their deepest fears with the crews. Not out of dishonesty, out of compassion. Every man already understood the seriousness of the situation. There was little value in repeating what everyone could plainly see. The water was nearly gone. Food had vanished. Strength continued fading. Still, the boats pressed onward. A mile. Then another. The Pacific remained silent around them. The survivors did not yet know how many more days separated them from rescue. They only knew they had to endure another sunrise. And then another after that. Because somewhere beyond the endless eastern horizon, land still waited. Whether they possessed enough strength to reach it remained the unanswered question that followed every exhausted man into another restless night. The morning light spread slowly across the Pacific. It revealed 3 weathered whaleboats, patched with scraps of timber from the lost Essex, drifting over a calm sea that gave no hint of the suffering aboard them. The survivors had now spent weeks in boats never intended for voyages of this length. Their world had become astonishingly small. A few wooden planks beneath their feet. Single mast, patch sail, compass, several nearly empty water casks. Beyond those few possessions stretched thousands of miles of open ocean. Captain George Pollard continued his daily routine with quiet determination. He checked the wind before sunrise. He studied the compass. He estimated the course. Routine had become a form of discipline. As long as the officers continued behaving like sailors, the crews found it easier to remember that they were still fighting to survive. The water ration that morning was even smaller than before. Every cup was measured carefully. The officers watched each serving disappear. There was no possibility of increasing the amount. The casks simply did not contain enough. The men drank slowly, trying to convince themselves that tiny mouthfuls might somehow satisfy overwhelming thirst. They never did. Within minutes, their mouths became dry again. The heat of the day soon returned. The sun reflected from the sea with such intensity that many survivors struggled to keep their eyes open for long. Some wrapped strips of worn clothing around their heads. Others lowered their hats over their faces whenever they could rest. Even the smallest patch of shade became valuable. The physical changes among the crew had become impossible to ignore. Their arms, once strong from years of hauling sails and rowing heavy whaleboats, had grown thin. Their cheeks had hollowed dramatically. Every rib showed beneath weathered skin. The transformation had happened gradually. Had they seen themselves in a proper mirror, few would have recognized the faces looking back. Thomas Nickerson occasionally caught glimpses of his reflection in the calm water. The boy who had left Nantucket seemed gone. Looking back was someone older. Not in years. In experience. In suffering. He later wrote that the ordeal changed him forever, even after he eventually returned home. During the afternoon, the breeze weakened once more. The patched sails fluttered uncertainly. Progress slowed. The boats no longer cut steadily through the water. Instead, they drifted with frustrating slowness. The officers could do little except wait. No amount of determination could create wind. Several sailors took turns rowing whenever conditions became completely calm. The effort produced only modest progress. Each pull of the oars demanded precious energy their starving bodies struggled to provide. After only a short time, they exchanged places with another exhausted companion. Nobody possessed much strength anymore. One unexpected visitor appeared beside the boats that day. A large sea turtle surfaced nearby. For several hopeful moments, it floated quietly. The sailors knew what such an animal represented. Food, fresh blood, moisture, life. Without hesitation, several men attempted to capture it. The turtle remained within reach only briefly. Then, sensing movement, it slipped beneath the surface. The clear Pacific swallowed it completely. The opportunity vanished. The disappointment lingered. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. Nature had offered another chance. Nature had taken it away again. As evening approached, Owen Chase quietly compared navigation estimates with Captain Pollard. Both men reached nearly the same conclusion. They had covered an extraordinary distance. But they had also lost more strength than either had expected. The numbers no longer seemed to favor them. Their boats might reach South America. Whether the men inside them could survive the journey remained uncertain. The officers carefully avoided discussing these calculations where everyone could hear. not because they wished to hide the truth. The truth already surrounded them. Each survivor could feel it in his own body. One sailor struggled to stand. Another's hands shook noticeably while adjusting the sail. Several men spent long periods simply staring across the sea. Starvation affects not only muscle, but slows thought itself. The evenings had become strangely reflective. When the sun descended toward the western horizon, conversation occasionally returned. The topics were always familiar. Home, family, Nantucket, simple memories. One sailor remembered chopping firewood during cold New England winters. Another described the sound of church bells drifting across the harbor. Thomas quietly recalled walking along the docks as a boy, watching ships prepare for distant voyages. At the time, those vessels had seemed symbols of adventure. Now they represented something different. Safety. As darkness settled over the Pacific, the stars emerged once again. The sky remained astonishingly clear. Captain Pollard used the constellations to confirm the course whenever possible. For centuries, sailors had depended upon these same stars. They offered guidance. They could not offer rescue. That night, the survivors rested little. Cold winds swept across the open boats after sunset. Without sufficient food, their bodies struggled to produce warmth. Several men shivered continuously until dawn. Others drifted into restless sleep only to wake moments later from vivid dreams. Thomas Nickerson later remembered dreaming of hearing church bells from Nantucket. The sound felt so real that he briefly believed rescue had already come. When he opened his eyes, only the gentle movement of the sea greeted him. Morning eventually returned. The routine began again. Compass, course, water, horizon. Oh. The Pacific remained silent. Modern historians examining the journals and later accounts of Owen Chase and Thomas Nickerson have noted how remarkable the survivors' discipline remained during this period. Even as starvation and thirst reached extreme levels, the officers continued recording observations, making navigational decisions, and preserving order as long as circumstances allowed. Yet every passing day narrowed their possibilities. The supplies were nearly exhausted. The men were growing weaker. The coast they sought still lay somewhere beyond the eastern horizon. And before long, the struggle would enter the most heartbreaking phase documented in the historical record, one that would forever distinguish the true story of the Essex from the fictional tale it later inspired. The Pacific did not announce the beginning of a new chapter in the survivors' ordeal. There was no sudden storm, no dramatic change in the weather. The sea remained calm, rising and falling in long, slow swells beneath the three weathered whaleboats. The change came from within the men themselves. Their bodies had reached the limits of what weeks of starvation and dehydration could endure. Every movement had become deliberate. Every task required concentration. Some survivors found that standing too quickly caused the world to spin around them. Others noticed their hands trembling even while they rested. Their strength had not disappeared all at once. It had been taken away a little each day. Captain George Pollard looked across the boats one quiet morning and saw men who only weeks earlier had hunted the largest animals on Earth with remarkable courage. Now they struggled to lift an oar. The contrast weighed heavily upon him. Leadership during such circumstances meant making decisions no captain ever wished to face. He continued distributing the remaining water with complete fairness. Every measure was exact. No officer received more than an ordinary sailor. The men noticed this. Although hunger and thirst had weakened them physically, their sense of justice remained intact. Trust between the crews continued to hold. That trust would become increasingly important. The breeze that morning was light. Enough to move the boats. Not enough to carry them quickly. The patched sails hung quietly overhead, filling and relaxing as the wind shifted. The boats advanced slowly toward an unseen coastline that still lay somewhere far beyond the eastern horizon. Time itself had become difficult to measure. The survivors still counted the days as best they could, but exhaustion blurred memory. One sunrise seemed almost identical to the next. Only the shrinking water supply reminded them that time continued moving forward. Thomas Nickerson later wrote that he often tried to calculate how long they had been away from the Essex. Sometimes he believed one number. Hours later he doubted himself. Without ordinary routines, the passage of days became strangely uncertain. The body focused entirely on immediate survival. One afternoon, several small fish appeared beneath the boats again. The sailors reacted with quiet determination. Improvised fishing lines were lowered carefully. Nobody wasted unnecessary movement. After a long wait, one fish was caught. Then another. The catch was modest. It could not satisfy 17 hungry men. Still, the fresh meat provided desperately needed nourishment. The fish were divided into tiny portions. Every survivor received a share. The meal disappeared within moments. Its effect upon morale lasted much longer. Even the smallest success reminded them that survival remained possible. As evening approached, the sky became overcast. Dark clouds slowly gathered from the south. Every eye turned upward. Rain had become more valuable than almost anything else. The first drops arrived shortly before sunset. The men hurried to collect every possible ounce of fresh water. Buckets, pieces of canvas stretched into makeshift funnels. Some simply held open their mouths. The shower remained brief. But this time it was enough to replenish the casks slightly. Relief spread quietly through the boats. No one celebrated loudly. They had learned not to expect too much from fortune. Yet they knew those extra gallons might mean several additional days of life. Night descended beneath heavy clouds. Few stars were visible. Captain Pollard relied more heavily upon his compass than celestial observations. The darkness felt deeper than usual. The wind freshened slightly, carrying the boats onward through the unseen Pacific. During the night, several survivors experienced vivid dreams. Historical accounts describe how prolonged starvation often blurred the boundary between sleeping and waking. Thomas Nickerson later recalled hearing voices that seemed completely real. He believed family members were speaking nearby. Another sailor imagined church bells. Someone else thought he smelled fresh bread. The senses searched desperately for familiar comfort. Morning always brought the same painful truth. There was only the sea. As the next day progressed, Owen Chase noticed that several men had become noticeably weaker than only a few days earlier. They tired almost immediately while rowing. Some required help simply changing position inside the crowded boats. Their muscles had been consumed steadily by starvation. The officers quietly adjusted responsibilities once again. Those who retained slightly more strength accepted additional work. No one objected. Every man understood that tomorrow he might be the one needing assistance. The spirit of cooperation remained one of the most remarkable aspects of the Essex survivors' ordeal. Modern historians studying their journals have frequently noted that discipline and mutual support continued far longer than many might expect under such desperate conditions. Late that afternoon, the sea changed color slightly. The deep blue waters gradually became greener. Experienced sailors noticed such details immediately. Changes in water color sometimes suggested approaching continental shelves or different ocean currents. The observation produced cautious optimism. Could the coast finally be drawing nearer? Captain Pollard avoided making promises. Many signs at sea proved misleading. Still, he carefully recorded the observation. Every clue mattered. Several seabirds also appeared overhead before sunset. Unlike previous days, they lingered longer. Some flew repeatedly in the same direction. Again, hope quietly returned. Birds often traveled between feeding grounds and land. Perhaps this time they truly indicated a coastline nearby. No one dared believe it completely. The Pacific had disappointed them too many times before. As darkness settled once more, the boats continued eastward. The survivors remained exhausted, hungry, thirsty, yet still determined. They had endured the whale attack. They had survived the loss of the Essex. They had crossed an astonishing portion of the Pacific in 3 fragile whaleboats. Now every man fixed his thoughts upon one possibility: land. Somewhere ahead, beyond the darkness, the coast of South America still waited. Whether they would reach it in time remained uncertain. But after weeks of nothing except open ocean, the smallest signs now suggested that the end of their endless voyage might finally be approaching. The signs were subtle. No shoreline appeared at sunrise. No mountain peaks rose above the eastern horizon. Yet experienced seamen noticed small changes that would have escaped an untrained eye. The water beneath the boats no longer looked exactly the same. More seabirds crossed overhead during the day. Floating patches of seaweed appeared from time to time, drifting silently with the current. Each observation suggested they were entering different waters. No one dared celebrate. The Pacific had already taught them how easily hope could become disappointment. Captain George Pollard continued to make careful navigational observations whenever the weather allowed. His calculations still placed the boat somewhere far west of the South American coast, but he believed they were steadily approaching the region where more ships might be encountered. That possibility mattered almost as much as land itself. A passing vessel could mean immediate rescue. The men searched the horizon constantly. Every distant cloud became a possible sail. Every unusual shape demanded another careful look. Again and again the answer remained the same: nothing. The physical condition of the survivors continued to decline. Their movements had become painfully slow. Simple tasks that once required only moments now occupied several minutes. Raising a sail, adjusting a rope, shifting supplies from one side of a boat to the other. Everything demanded effort. Everything consumed precious energy. Thomas Nickerson later remembered that even speaking sometimes felt like hard work. The men conserved their strength whenever possible. Silence became the natural state aboard the boats. Only the sounds of wind and water filled the long hours. The small amount of rain collected the previous day had delayed one crisis. It had not solved it. Fresh water still had to be measured with extraordinary care. Captain Pollard continued insisting upon absolute fairness. Each ration was poured carefully. No one received more. No one received less. The officers accepted exactly the same allowance as everyone else. That example helped preserve discipline during circumstances that might easily have destroyed it. Hunger had now become something beyond ordinary experience. It affected every thought. Several survivors found themselves staring at the sea almost without realizing it. Others spoke quietly about meals they had eaten years before. One sailor described warm bread fresh from an oven. Another remembered roasted potatoes served during a winter evening at home. The conversations were never complaints. They were memories. Simple reminders that another life had once existed beyond the endless ocean. Late that afternoon, one of the sailors spotted movement beneath the surface. A large fish circled the boats briefly before disappearing. The men immediately prepared their improvised fishing gear. They waited patiently. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. Finally a strike. The fish fought fiercely despite its size. The weakened sailors worked together with remarkable determination, and at last they pulled it aboard. It was not large enough to satisfy 17 starving men, but it was enough to provide each survivor with another small portion of fresh food. The meal restored a little strength. Perhaps more importantly, it restored morale. For a short time conversation returned. Someone remarked that the sea had not abandoned them completely. Another quietly agreed. As evening approached, however, the officers reviewed their overall situation once more. The numbers remained deeply troubling. Even with occasional fish and collected rainwater, the boats had almost nothing in reserve. They were surviving from one fortunate moment to the next. There was no margin for another long period without food or rain. No room for another serious storm. No room for delay. That night, the Pacific was unusually calm. The boats drifted beneath a sky filled with countless stars. Captain Pollard confirmed their course using familiar constellations while Owen Chase quietly examined the condition of the boats. The patched hulls had endured far longer than anyone might have expected. The men inside them were another matter. Several survivors coughed frequently. Others had become too weak to sit upright for long periods. The officers exchanged concerned glances. No words were necessary. They both understood. The greatest danger was no longer the ocean. It was time. Thomas Nickerson lay awake for much of the night. He later wrote that he thought often of Nantucket during those quiet hours. He imagined the harbor, the familiar streets, the voices of neighbors. He wondered whether anyone at home had begun to fear that the Essex might never return. In reality, months would pass before reliable news of the disaster reached their families. Across the Atlantic world, life continued as normal. Ships sailed. Markets opened. Children played along the docks. No one yet knew that 17 men were fighting for life in the middle of the Pacific. Morning arrived beneath a pale sky. The wind strengthened slightly. The boats moved steadily eastward. Then, sometime during the day, the survivors noticed something different. Birds. Not one or two. Several. They flew with purpose rather than wandering randomly over the open sea. Experienced sailors recognized the pattern immediately. Such birds often traveled between feeding grounds and land. It was not proof, but it was the strongest indication they had seen in many days. Hope stirred quietly once again. Still, the officers remained cautious. The historical record shows that even at this stage, they could not know how much farther they still had to travel or whether another ship might appear first. Their ordeal was far from over. Indeed, the hardest decisions recorded in Owen Chase's narrative and later confirmed by Thomas Nickerson still lay ahead. The ocean had tested their endurance. Soon it would test something even deeper: their judgment, their humanity, and their determination to survive under circumstances almost beyond imagination. The birds continued to appear. Not constantly, not in great numbers, but often enough that the experienced whalemen noticed the pattern. Each sighting brought a quiet stir among the survivors. For weeks they had searched an empty horizon where nothing changed except the position of the sun. Now, at least, the ocean offered signs that they might be approaching waters more frequently crossed by ships or influenced by the nearby continent. No one allowed hope to grow too quickly. They had been disappointed before. Captain George Pollard remained careful in both his words and his actions. Every morning he continued the same routine. Compass, course, weather, water. The order never changed. Routine had become the one thing starvation could not take away. Owen Chase also maintained his daily inspections of the boats. The patched hulls creaked with every swell. The leaking boat still required regular bailing. Although the repairs continued to hold, the men performing the work had become frighteningly weak. Each bucket lifted over the side seemed heavier than the last. The boats themselves had survived remarkably well. The men inside them were another story. Their bodies had become little more than skin stretched over bone. Weeks of inadequate nourishment had consumed nearly every reserve they once possessed. The strongest sailors aboard the Essex now resembled men recovering from a long illness. Thomas Nickerson later wrote that he could feel every plank beneath him whenever he shifted position. There was almost no flesh left to cushion his body. Sleep had become uncomfortable even when exhaustion overcame him. The surviving water was measured again that morning. Only small portions remained. The rain they had collected several days earlier had delayed disaster, but it had not prevented it. Every sip had to be earned by another day of endurance. The officers refused to alter the system. Every man received exactly the same amount. No exceptions. No favoritism. That fairness remained one of the few certainties left in their lives. Late in the morning the wind freshened. The patched sails filled steadily, carrying the boats eastward at their best speed in many days. The survivors welcomed the movement. There was no cheering. They no longer possessed the strength. But several men watched the wake trailing behind their boats with quiet satisfaction. For the first time in days, they felt they were making meaningful progress. The Pacific remained unusually calm despite the stronger breeze. Long rolling swells lifted the boats gently before lowering them again. The motion had become so familiar that many barely noticed it anymore. It was simply the rhythm of survival. Around midday, one of the sailors pointed silently toward the horizon. Everyone who could still sit upright looked. For a moment, a dark shape seemed visible far in the distance. Sail, perhaps. Or perhaps another cloud resting low above the sea. No one spoke until Captain Pollard carefully examined it through the spyglass. Minutes passed. The object slowly changed shape, then dissolved completely. Another cloud. Another disappointment. The spyglass was lowered without a word. The boats continued onward. Hope had become cautious now. It no longer rushed ahead of reason. During the afternoon, several flying fish landed unexpectedly among the boats. The survivors reacted almost instantly. Even weakened hands moved with remarkable speed when food appeared. Every fish was gathered. Nothing was wasted. The catch was small, but enough to divide into tiny portions once again. The meal disappeared quickly. Still, it brought genuine relief. Fresh food, however little, reminded the body that survival remained possible. As evening approached, the officers reviewed their navigation together. Their estimates suggested that they had traveled one of the greatest open-boat voyages ever attempted to that point in history. Neither man found comfort in that thought. Extraordinary distance meant little if they failed to reach safety. The calculations remained uncertain. Ocean currents, changing winds, and imperfect instruments all influenced their position. Yet both officers agreed upon one point. If fortune remained with them, they should soon be entering waters where merchant ships occasionally passed. That possibility quietly spread through the crews. No promises were made. Only possibility. Night arrived beneath clear skies. The stars seemed brighter than ever. Captain Pollard used them once again to confirm his course. For centuries, sailors had trusted these same constellations while crossing every ocean on Earth. Tonight they remained silent witnesses to the suffering below. Thomas Nickerson lay awake listening to the gentle sound of water against the hull. He later recalled that the ocean itself had begun to sound different after so many weeks. Every splash, every creak of the wood, every movement of the sail had become deeply familiar. The sea was no longer simply their surroundings. It had become their entire existence. He wondered how long a person could continue living this way. Morning came with another pale sunrise. The survivors repeated the same routine they had followed for weeks. They checked the horizon, adjusted the sails, measured the water, waited. The wind remained favorable. The boats continued eastward. Then, sometime during the day, the officers noticed another encouraging sign. The color of the water continued changing. Floating vegetation appeared more frequently. The seabirds returned once again. Each observation alone meant little. Taken together, they suggested that the Pacific was slowly giving way to waters influenced by the South American coast. The survivors could not yet see land. They could not know exactly how much farther remained. But after enduring the whale attack, the sinking of the Essex, Henderson Island, starvation, thirst, illness, and weeks upon weeks in open boats, they sensed that the longest part of their voyage might finally be drawing toward its conclusion. Whether rescue would arrive in time remained uncertain. History records that fate had not yet finished testing the men of the Essex. Their final trials, and the moment that would ultimately bring salvation to some while forever changing the lives of all who survived, were now close at hand. The morning began much like the one before it. A pale sun climbed above the eastern horizon. The Pacific rolled gently beneath the three battered whaleboats. The survivors woke slowly, if they had truly slept at all. Rest had become difficult. Hunger interrupted sleep. Thirst interrupted dreams. Cold winds during the night left aching bodies stiff by dawn, while the afternoon sun drained what little strength remained. Still another day had arrived, and with it another chance. Captain George Pollard rose carefully, steadying himself against the side of the boat before looking toward the horizon. His movements were noticeably slower than they had been only weeks before. Starvation had affected him just as it had affected every other man. Leadership had never exempted him from suffering. He checked the compass. The course remained unchanged. Always east. Owen Chase completed his own observations in silence. The patched sail still held. The mast remained secure. The leaking hull required attention again, and 2 sailors began bailing seawater over the side with slow, practiced movements. No one complained. The work had become part of life. Every bucket emptied meant another hour afloat. The water ration that morning was painfully small. Each man accepted his portion with quiet gratitude. There was no discussion about whether it should be larger. The barrels answered that question themselves. When Captain Pollard lifted one to judge its weight, there was scarcely enough inside to produce a proper sound against the wood. Every remaining drop mattered. The survivors spent much of the morning scanning the sea. Their eyes had become remarkably skilled at detecting movement on the horizon. A distant cloud, flock of birds, floating driftwood. Anything unusual immediately drew attention. Again and again, the empty ocean reminded them how vast it truly was. Thomas Nickerson later remembered that he had begun measuring hope differently. At the beginning of the ordeal, hope meant reaching South America. Now hope simply meant seeing another ship. Any ship. A merchant vessel. Whaler. Even the smallest brig crossing the Pacific could change everything. As the boats continued eastward, more seabirds appeared overhead. Unlike previous days, some remained nearby for several minutes before flying onward. The experienced sailors watched carefully. Birds often rested on islands or coastal cliffs before returning to sea. Their presence encouraged cautious optimism. No one celebrated. Experience had taught them patience. During the afternoon, the wind strengthened slightly. The boats made better progress than they had in several days. The patched sails filled steadily, and for the first time in what seemed like weeks, the survivors could see a noticeable wake stretching behind them. Movement lifted spirits. Even exhausted men found renewed determination when they believed they were drawing closer to safety. The sea itself also seemed different. The water had taken on a greener hue than the deep blue of the open Pacific. Floating seaweed appeared more frequently. Pieces of driftwood occasionally passed alongside the boats. Each sign suggested they were approaching waters influenced by the South American coast. Captain Pollard carefully compared these observations with his navigation. The evidence pointed in the same direction. They were getting closer. But closer remained a dangerous word. Closer could still mean hundreds of miles. Closer did not guarantee survival. Late that afternoon, a cry broke the silence. Sail! Every man who still possessed enough strength lifted his head. Far to the east, barely visible against the bright sky, stood what appeared to be the faint outline of a ship. No one moved immediately. Too many clouds had deceived them before. Captain Pollard reached for the spyglass with trembling hands. He steadied himself, focused carefully. For several long moments he said nothing. Then he lowered the glass. It is a ship. The words spread from boat to boat almost in whispers. Ship. Real ship. Not a cloud. Not an illusion. The vessel remained extremely distant. Whether it had seen the tiny whaleboats was impossible to know. The survivors did everything they could to attract attention. Pieces of cloth were raised. The boats altered their course as much as the wind allowed. Weak arms waved desperately. Every eye remained fixed upon the distant sail. Minute after minute passed. The ship continued moving. Sometimes it appeared slightly larger. Sometimes it seemed no closer at all. Distance at sea is famously deceptive. The survivors could only wait. As the afternoon wore on, uncertainty returned. Had the ship noticed them? Would it pass beyond the horizon? The questions weighed heavily on every exhausted sailor. Captain Pollard refused to surrender hope. He ordered the men to continue signaling whenever possible. Even the weakest survivors lifted scraps of cloth into the air. They understood this might be the opportunity upon which every remaining life depended. As sunset approached, the distant vessel remained visible. It neither disappeared nor came close enough to remove all doubt. The survivors watched until fading light finally swallowed the horizon. Darkness ended all possibility of signaling. The boats drifted beneath another sky filled with stars. Sleep proved nearly impossible. Every man wondered the same thing. Would the ship still be there at sunrise? Would it find them? Or would another chance disappear into the endless Pacific? History records that rescue was now nearer than it had been at any moment since the Essex slipped beneath the waves. Yet fate had one final stretch of uncertainty before the ordeal reached its long-awaited turning point. The next sunrise would reveal whether the distant sail had become their salvation, or another heartbreaking illusion on the world's largest ocean. The first light of morning spread slowly across the eastern horizon. Before anyone spoke, before the sails were adjusted, before the remaining drops of water were measured, every pair of eyes searched for the same thing: a ship. For several anxious moments, the horizon revealed nothing except the gentle meeting of sea and sky. Then someone pointed. A faint white sail. It was still there. A quiet wave of relief passed through the exhausted survivors. No one possessed the strength to cheer, but every man felt a renewed determination. After weeks of staring at an empty horizon, the sight of another vessel seemed almost unbelievable. Captain George Pollard immediately studied the distant ship through the spyglass. The vessel remained several miles away. Whether those aboard had noticed the tiny whaleboats was impossible to tell. Distance at sea can be deceptive. A ship that appears close may still be hours away. The survivors prepared every signal they could. Pieces of clothing were tied to oars. The patched sails were adjusted to make the boats more visible. Those who still had enough strength stood whenever the motion of the sea allowed, waving whatever cloth remained in their possession. Every movement demanded effort. Every effort carried hope. The wind favored both the boats and the distant vessel. Slowly, very slowly, the distance seemed to lessen. Owen Chase never allowed himself to assume success too early. Years at sea had taught him caution. Clouds, weather, and shifting winds could alter everything. Still, he continued watching through the spyglass whenever Captain Pollard handed it to him. At last, a change became visible. The distant ship altered its course. Only slightly at first, then more noticeably. The officers exchanged silent glances. If the ship had truly changed course toward them, there could be only one explanation. Someone aboard had finally seen the boats. Even then, certainty remained impossible. The survivors continued signaling. Weak arms lifted scraps of cloth again and again. The morning passed with agonizing slowness. The vessel gradually became clearer. Its mast, sails, its hull. Every passing minute transformed it from a tiny shape on the horizon into an unmistakable ship. Historical records identify the vessel as the Indian, a British merchant ship sailing from London toward Valparaiso, Chile. On February 18, 1821, after nearly 3 months in open boats following the sinking of the Essex, the crew aboard the Indian discovered one of the drifting whaleboats. This was the boat commanded by Owen Chase. As the ship drew nearer, the sailors aboard her began making out the condition of the men below. At first, they reportedly struggled to believe what they were seeing. The figures inside the whaleboats scarcely resembled healthy sailors. Their clothes hung in tatters. Their faces were deeply hollow. Their skin had been darkened by months of sun and salt. Many could barely stand. Some lacked the strength even to wave. When the Indian finally came alongside, ropes were lowered. The crew called out to the survivors. Several of the Essex sailors attempted to answer. Their voices were little more than whispers. Many were too weak to climb without assistance. The sailors aboard the merchant vessel quickly realized these men required immediate help. They were carefully lifted aboard. Food was not given freely at first. Experienced seamen understood that people suffering from prolonged starvation could become dangerously ill if they ate too much too quickly. Instead, small portions of light nourishment and water were provided gradually. Every bite was carefully controlled. Every cup was measured. The rescuers understood that survival did not end the moment a person stepped aboard another ship. Recovery itself required caution. For Owen Chase and the men rescued with him, the nightmare that had begun on November 20th, 1820, had finally come to an end. The feeling was almost impossible to describe. Weeks earlier they had watched the Essex disappear beneath the Pacific. They had crossed thousands of miles in an open whaleboat. They had endured storms, relentless heat, freezing nights, starvation, thirst, and the constant uncertainty of whether another sunrise would be their last. Now they stood upon the deck of a real ship once more. Solid planks beneath their feet. Fresh water. Shelter. Human voices that did not belong to exhausted companions drifting beside them. Yet relief was incomplete. Captain George Pollard was not aboard. Neither was the crew of his boat, nor the remaining survivors who had been separated during the voyage. Even while accepting rescue, Owen Chase understood that friends and shipmates were still somewhere upon the Pacific. Whether they remained alive, no one could say. The officers aboard the Indian gathered every detail they could about the disaster. The story seemed almost unbelievable. A whale large enough to sink a whaleship. 3 small boats crossing one of the largest oceans on Earth. Weeks without adequate food or water. Few people had ever heard anything comparable. Still, the evidence stood before them. The survivors themselves. Thin beyond recognition. Barely able to walk. Living proof that the impossible voyage had truly occurred. As the Indian continued toward South America with the rescued sailors safely aboard, every man remaining on deck looked westward at least once. Far beyond the horizon, Captain Pollard and others were still drifting across the Pacific. Their own struggle was not yet over. History would soon record another remarkable rescue. But first, the ocean would demand that they endure several more desperate days before help finally reached them. Aboard the Indian, the rescued survivors slowly began the difficult journey back toward health. The change was almost overwhelming. For nearly 3 months, Owen Chase and the men from his boat had known nothing except the cramped confines of an open whaleboat. Every waking hour had been filled with thoughts of food, water, weather, and survival. Now there were solid decks beneath their feet. Fresh water. Shelter from the relentless sun. The simple sound of ordinary sailors moving about a working ship felt strangely comforting. Even so, recovery came slowly. The officers of the Indian understood that men weakened by prolonged starvation could not immediately return to normal meals. Food was introduced gradually in small portions. Water was given carefully rather than in great quantities. Their bodies needed time to recover after weeks of extreme deprivation. Modern medicine recognizes this danger as refeeding syndrome, though the sailors of 1821 understood it only through practical experience. Owen Chase later reflected that even while standing safely aboard another vessel, his thoughts rarely left the Pacific behind him. Captain George Pollard was still missing. So were the remaining survivors. No one aboard the Indian knew where the other boats had drifted. The ocean was simply too large. There was no practical way to search every mile of water. The merchant ship continued its own voyage toward the coast of South America. Everyone hoped another vessel might encounter Pollard before it was too late. Far to the west, Captain George Pollard's whaleboat continued drifting. The conditions aboard had become even more desperate. The men remaining with Pollard had endured the same storms, the same relentless heat, the same shrinking water supply, and the same exhausting weeks in an open boat. They had no way of knowing that Owen Chase had already been rescued. For all they knew, every other boat had already disappeared beneath the Pacific. Still, Pollard continued navigating eastward. His leadership never abandoned its discipline. The compass remained precious. The sail was adjusted whenever the wind changed. The remaining water was measured with complete fairness. Routine continued because routine preserved hope. Thomas Nickerson was no longer with Pollard. He had been in Owen Chase's boat, and his rescue aboard the Indian meant that one of the youngest members of the Essex crew had survived one of the longest open-boat voyages ever recorded. Years later, Nickerson would write his own account of the disaster, providing historians with one of the most valuable first-hand descriptions of the tragedy. His memoir, forgotten for many years before its rediscovery in the 20th century, confirmed and expanded many details found in Owen Chase's earlier narrative. Meanwhile, Pollard's boat struggled onward. The survivors had become astonishingly thin. Their clothing hung in tatters. Every movement demanded careful effort. Even raising the small sail required cooperation. The Pacific remained deceptively calm. Gentle swells rolled beneath the boat. The weather was almost beautiful. To anyone viewing the scene from a distance, the ocean might have appeared peaceful. Only those aboard understood the immense suffering hidden within that quiet landscape. Each morning began with the same ritual. Search the horizon. Study the wind. Adjust the sail. Measure the water. Continue east. Every evening ended with disappointment. No ship. No coastline. Only another sunset. Yet Captain Pollard refused to surrender. His duty remained clear. As long as one man aboard his boat still breathed, he would continue leading them toward safety. The remaining sailors responded with remarkable discipline. Despite unimaginable hardship, there was still no collapse of order. The officers and crew continued working together as they had since the sinking of the Essex. Historians have often pointed to this extraordinary cooperation as one of the defining features of the survivors' ordeal. Without mutual trust and disciplined leadership, it is difficult to imagine that anyone could have crossed such an immense distance in boats never intended for voyages of this length. Several more days passed. The Pacific continued stretching endlessly in every direction. Then, at last, another sail appeared upon the horizon. This time it was no illusion. The vessel was the Dauphin, an American whaleship operating in the Pacific. On February 23, 1821, the Dauphin encountered Captain George Pollard's drifting boat and rescued the two surviving men aboard. They had spent approximately 93 days at sea since the Essex sank. The crew of the Dauphin was stunned by what they found. Captain Pollard and Charles Ramsdell were barely recognizable. Months of starvation and exposure had transformed them into shadows of the healthy Nantucket whalemen who had sailed aboard the Essex. Like the crew of the Indian, the rescuers acted carefully. Food and water were introduced gradually. Medical attention, limited though it was by the standards of the early 19th century, was provided immediately. For Captain Pollard, the nightmare was finally over. Yet another painful reality remained. Not every man who had escaped the sinking of the Essex had lived to see rescue. Some would never return to Nantucket. Their names would remain forever linked to one of the most extraordinary survival stories in maritime history. Only one chapter remained before the voyage finally reached its conclusion. A chapter not about the Pacific itself, but about what happened after the survivors returned home, how their story inspired Herman Melville decades later, and why the tragedy of the Essex continues to be remembered more than 200 years after a whale changed the course of history. The voyage across the Pacific was finally over. For the survivors, however, the journey itself had not truly ended. Rescue brought safety, did not erase memory. The men who stepped ashore in South America during the early months of 1821 were not the same sailors who had departed Nantucket more than a year earlier aboard the Essex. Weeks in open whaleboats had changed them physically beyond recognition, and the experiences they carried home would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The first weeks after rescue were devoted largely to recovery. Food had to be reintroduced slowly. Muscles weakened by starvation required time to regain strength. Even walking any significant distance proved difficult for several of the survivors. Simple tasks that healthy people perform without thought, climbing stairs, lifting a bucket, standing for long periods, had become exhausting. Gradually, however, strength returned. Not completely, but enough for the survivors to continue the long trip back toward the United States. News of the disaster spread slowly. In 1821, there were no telegraphs crossing oceans, no radio, No instant communication. Information traveled only as fast as ships could carry letters from one port to another. When reports finally reached Nantucket, families learned that the Essex had not simply disappeared. It had been attacked and sunk by a whale. The story seemed almost impossible to believe. For generations, whalers had hunted sperm whales across the world's oceans. Ships were occasionally damaged. Boats were sometimes overturned. But an enormous whale deliberately striking a whaleship with enough force to sink it was almost unheard of. Yet the survivors themselves stood as living proof. Captain George Pollard eventually returned to Nantucket carrying both relief and sorrow. He had survived. Many of the men entrusted to his command had not. Like many captains of his era, Pollard accepted full responsibility for the fate of his vessel, even though the whale attack itself had been beyond human control. His reputation within the close-knit Nantucket whaling community remained complicated. Many respected the calm leadership he had shown after the sinking. Others focused upon the tragic loss of the ship and crew. Historical records suggest that Pollard found it difficult to secure another command afterward. He later captained the whaleship Two Brothers, but that voyage also ended in shipwreck after the vessel struck a reef near the Hawaiian Islands in 1823. Although everyone survived, the second loss effectively ended his career as a deep-sea captain. Pollard eventually returned to Nantucket, where he spent many years working as a night watchman, living a quiet life far removed from the great whaling voyages of his youth. Owen Chase followed a different path. He continued sailing for several years and eventually became captain of his own whaleships. Shortly after returning home, he wrote a detailed first-hand account titled Narrative of the Most Extraordinary and Distressing Shipwreck of the Whaleship Essex. Published in 1821, the book provided one of the earliest and most important eyewitness descriptions of the disaster. Historians still rely heavily upon Chase's narrative because it was written while the memories remained fresh. Thomas Nickerson also returned to Nantucket. Only 14 years old when the Essex sailed, he had survived an ordeal that few adults could imagine. He spent much of his life at sea afterward, eventually becoming a captain himself. Late in life, he wrote his own recollections of the voyage. Unlike Chase's book, Nickerson's manuscript remained largely unknown for many decades before historians rediscovered it in the 20th century. Its publication provided valuable confirmation of many events described earlier by Owen Chase while adding important personal details from the perspective of the ship's young cabin boy. The story of the Essex gradually entered maritime history. Whalers discussed it in ports around the world. Sailors repeated the account across the Atlantic and Pacific. The idea that a whale had deliberately rammed and sunk a large whaleship captured the imagination of people far beyond New England. Among those who later heard the story was a young American writer named Herman Melville. In 1841, while serving aboard the whaleship Acushnet, Melville encountered Owen Chase's published narrative. Years later, he also met the son of Captain George Pollard while visiting Nantucket. These experiences helped shape the ideas that eventually became Moby-Dick, or The Whale, published in 1851. Although Melville's novel is a work of fiction, many of its most memorable elements, the aggressive sperm whale, the whaling industry, the dangers of the Pacific, and the psychological impact of obsession, owe much to the true events aboard the Essex. Yet the real story differs profoundly from the novel. Captain Pollard was not Captain Ahab. Owen Chase was not Ishmael. The whale that struck the Essex disappeared into history immediately after the attack. No long pursuit followed. No final battle between captain and whale ever occurred. The greatest struggle came afterward. Not against the whale. Against hunger. Against thirst. Against the immense loneliness of the Pacific. Those weeks drifting in fragile whaleboats became the true heart of the tragedy. It is that remarkable endurance, recorded by the survivors themselves, that continues to fascinate historians more than 2 centuries later. Only one final chapter remains. Reflecting on the lasting legacy of the Essex, what modern science has revealed about the whale's behavior, and why this extraordinary true story still resonates with readers, sailors, and historians around the world today. As the years passed, the story of the Essex refused to disappear. Many shipwrecks were recorded during the Great Age of Sail. Storms claimed countless vessels. Reefs destroyed others. Fire, disease, and war all left their mark upon maritime history. Yet the loss of the Essex remained different. It was not simply a shipwreck. It was a story in which one of the largest creatures ever to live had turned the tables on those who hunted it. That fact alone captured people's imagination. For generations, sailors repeated the account in ports across the Atlantic and Pacific. Some listeners believed every word. Others dismissed it as an exaggerated sea story. But Owen Chase's carefully written narrative, supported later by Thomas Nickerson's memoir and surviving official records, confirmed that the central events had truly happened. A sperm whale had rammed the Essex. The ship had sunk. The survivors had crossed thousands of miles of open ocean in fragile whaleboats. Modern historians have spent many years studying exactly why the whale attacked. The answer remains uncertain. No one aboard the Essex could ask the whale what had driven its behavior. The surviving eyewitnesses described what they saw with remarkable consistency, but the whale's motives remain beyond human knowledge. Marine biologists have proposed several possibilities. The whale may have been defending itself after previous encounters with whalers. It may have perceived the ship as a threat. Some researchers have suggested that the animal could have been disoriented or behaving aggressively during a period of heightened stress. Others caution that assigning human motives to wild animals is impossible. The truth is that no definitive explanation exists. What remains beyond dispute is the physical evidence recorded by the survivors. The whale struck the vessel with enormous force, damaging it so severely that Captain George Pollard and his officers recognized it could not be saved. The event stands as one of the few well-documented cases in which a sperm whale sank a large whaleship. The tragedy also changed how many people viewed whaling itself. During the early 19th century, whale oil illuminated homes, businesses, and streets throughout much of the world. Whales represented valuable natural resources. The Essex disaster reminded experienced whalers that these animals were not passive targets. A mature sperm whale could weigh more than 50 tons. Its massive head alone accounted for nearly 1/3 of its body length. A direct collision between such an animal and a wooden sailing ship carried tremendous destructive power. The men aboard the Essex learned that lesson in the most dramatic way imaginable. The influence of the story extended far beyond maritime history. When Herman Melville published Moby-Dick in 1851, the novel initially received mixed reviews and modest commercial success. Only decades later did readers begin recognizing it as one of the greatest works of American literature. Although Melville transformed real events into fiction, the emotional foundation of the novel, the isolation of the Pacific, the dangers of whaling, the awe inspired by the sperm whale, and humanity's struggle against forces beyond its control, grew directly from the history of the Essex. Historians continue studying the disaster because it brings together so many aspects of human experience. Leadership under extraordinary pressure. Navigation across one of the world's largest oceans. The limits of endurance. The discipline required to preserve order during catastrophe. And the remarkable resilience shown by ordinary sailors facing unimaginable hardship. The journals and memoirs left behind by Owen Chase and Thomas Nickerson remain invaluable precisely because they avoid unnecessary exaggeration. They describe events plainly, often with surprising restraint. That honesty gives their accounts lasting power. Reading them today, more than 2 centuries later, it is difficult not to imagine the endless horizon they faced each morning. The sound of seawater against weathered planks. The constant search for rain clouds. The careful measuring of each precious cup of water. The quiet determination that carried them eastward despite overwhelming odds. Modern technology has transformed ocean travel beyond recognition. Steel ships cross the Pacific with satellite navigation. Weather forecasts warn of approaching storms days in advance. Emergency beacons can summon help across thousands of miles. Yet the Pacific itself has not changed. It remains as vast today as it was in 1820. Standing on the deck of a modern vessel in the middle of that ocean, one still sees the same endless horizon that surrounded the survivors of the Essex. The same stars shine overhead. The same swells rise and fall beneath the hull. That continuity is one reason the story continues to feel so immediate. It reminds us that while technology changes, nature itself often does not. The whale vanished into history the moment it disappeared beneath the surface after striking the Essex. No one ever identified it again. No one knows where it lived or how long it survived afterward. It left behind no trace except damaged timbers resting on the floor of the Pacific, and the memories carried by those fortunate enough to return home. Those memories became books. Those books became history. That history inspired literature read around the world. And more than 200 years after the Essex slipped beneath the waves, the true story continues to be remembered. Not because it is larger than life, but because it was real. Only one final chapter remains, bringing this remarkable voyage gently to its close with the legacy the survivors left behind and the quiet reflection their story still invites today. The story of the Essex does not end when the survivors reached land. In many ways, that is where its long journey through history truly began. More than 2 centuries have passed since a sperm whale struck a small American whaleship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean on November 20, 1820. The ship itself disappeared beneath the waves within hours, but the account of what followed refused to sync with it. It endured because ordinary men recorded extraordinary events with remarkable honesty. Captain George Pollard never became a famous naval commander. Owen Chase never intended to become a celebrated author. Thomas Nickerson did not set out to write one of history's most valuable maritime memoirs. They simply described what had happened. That honesty gave later generations something rare. Not a legend, not a myth. True account. Modern historians continue comparing the surviving journals, official records, navigation logs, and published narratives. While small differences naturally exist, as they do in nearly every eyewitness account, the central events remain remarkably consistent. The Essex was attacked by a large sperm whale. The ship was abandoned. The crew crossed one of the greatest expanses of open ocean ever survived in small whaleboats. Several men were rescued after nearly 3 months at sea. Those facts are supported by multiple contemporary sources and remain among the best documented survival stories in maritime history. The influence of the disaster extended far beyond Nantucket, shaped maritime history. It inspired generations of writers. It encouraged scientists and historians to study sperm whales with greater care. It eventually helped inspire one of the greatest novels ever written in the English language, Moby-Dick, even though Herman Melville transformed the historical events into fiction for literary purposes. Yet perhaps the most remarkable lesson of the Essex lies not in the whale itself. The whale appears only briefly, strikes, disappears. The greater part of the story belongs to the people left behind. To 17 exhausted sailors who refused to surrender when their world vanished beneath the sea. To officers who continued measuring water fairly even while enduring the same thirst as everyone else. To ordinary crewmen who continued helping one another despite unimaginable hardship. Their quiet discipline became as important as their courage. Looking back across 2 centuries, it is easy to focus on the dramatic moment when the whale rammed the ship. But history often reminds us that the greatest tests come afterward. Not in the instant of disaster. In the long days that follow. When every sunrise asks whether hope can survive another day. The Pacific Ocean remains unchanged. Its immense blue horizon still stretches beyond sight. Its swells still rise and fall with the same slow rhythm that carried the Essex's tiny whaleboats eastward in 1820 and early 1821. Ships crossing those waters today pass through the same ocean, though modern navigation, communications, and rescue systems have transformed the experience of seafaring. The sea remembers nothing. People do. That is why the story continues to be told. Not because it is unbelievable, but because it happened. Every generation discovers it again and finds something different within it. Some see a remarkable survival story. Others see the dangers faced by 19th-century whalers. Some reflect on humanity's relationship with nature. Others simply marvel at the endurance of ordinary people confronted with extraordinary circumstances. Whatever draws someone to the history of the Essex, the voyage leaves behind the same quiet reminder. Even in the vastness of the world's largest ocean, even after overwhelming loss, even when the horizon appears empty day after day, human determination can endure far longer than anyone expects. And now, as the last light fades over the calm Pacific, imagine those gentle swells carrying the memory of a small whaleship that changed history forever. Picture the evening sky turning from warm gold to deep blue. The wind grows softer. The ocean settles into its endless rhythm. The stars appear one by one, just as they did above the survivors more than 200 years ago. Let your thoughts drift as peacefully as those quiet waters. Close your eyes. Take one slow, deep breath. Then another. Allow the sounds of the distant sea to fade gently into silence, carrying this remarkable true story with them, until all that remains is the calm horizon, the steady night sky, and the quiet feeling that history, like the ocean itself, never truly sleeps.